absence. Gareth Bacon is arriving late from another meeting that he's had in central Westminster. None. Let's move on then. I now need to move on to declarations of interest for those members. The information is before you that the officers are asking you to do. Can we note the list of officers held by Assembly members? Asked to declare any disclosable pecuniary interest in specific items listed on the agenda and declare any other relevant interest. Are there any? Okay, moving on to the minutes then of, can we confirm the minutes of our meeting on the 14th of December 2017 to be signed by me as a correct record?
Agreed.
Thank you very much. Moving on to item 4, can the summary list of actions, we're asked to note the actions arising from our previous meetings. Assembly Member Berry.
Yes, one of the things under that on page 45 is the response from the Mayor to our letter following our investigation into the use of personal data. It doesn't go into a lot of detail, but it's quite a good response. But at the end of it, he says he wants to engage in future constructive engagement with the committee, including to support public debate. I think we should get back to him and try and nail down what that might involve, because it would be a good idea, I think.
Okay, I'll do that on behalf of the committee and make sure that happens before the next meeting. Are there any other items under that? Can we note the rest of the items and take the action requested? Okay, let's move on to item 5, which is our main item of business. Can I welcome our guests? And before I just mention them all by name for those on the who are watching on the webcast, I just want to mention what the main focus of the meeting is. So it's how funds were distributed post the tragedy. We've invited some of the fundraisers so we can have a discussion about the whole of the system and the processes. One of the issues in the aftermath of the fire was the cause of some confusion. It's really the number of fundraising and distribution bodies involved. And there were lots more people we could have invited today, but we're not sure if that would have been very manageable. So we've got 9 guests before us today, so therefore we focus on those organisations that raised and distributed the bulk of the funds. However, we must recognise the contribution of all other charities involved and other coordinating groups, such as the Grenfell Muslims Response Unit, hosted by the National Zakat Foundation. So this meeting, just for the sake of anyone watching on the webcast or in our audience, will focus on monies and gifts in kind raised from the public and distributed to survivors and victims' families. It will not examine the monies raised by trust foundations, contributions of time by volunteers, members of the public, or the support for businesses. So we're quite clearly focused around those issues. Can I now welcome our guests? So David Farnsworth, Director of City Bridge Trust, Sarah Atkinson, Director of Policy and Planning Communication of the Charity Commission. And I just want to remind members again that Sarah has to leave us at 11 o'clock, so we need to focus any questions or direct it towards her so that can happen. Mark Sims, Chief Exec of the Rugby Portobello Trust. Susan Dalton, Director of Kensington Chelsea Foundation. Gerald Oppenheim, Chair of the London Emergencies Trust. Rob Bell, Director of the London Emergencies Trust. Zoe Abrams, Executive Director for Communications Engagement of British Red Cross. Mani Hoti, Director of Programmes of Strategic Partnerships London Community Foundation. And lastly, our very own GLA officer, Emma Strain, Assistant Director for External Affairs. Can I welcome you all? Can I go straight into our questions rather than take any opening statements? I think it would be best if we go straight to some of the issues that we wish to explore with you. And my first questions may well be, I think it's to you, Gerald, and to David. So if I can ask you, and it's really, I suppose, setting the scene in some ways, if we could cast our minds back to the London Bombings Charity Relief Fund, why was that process considered to be such a good model for distributing charitable funds following an emergency?
Shall I take that? Well, In 2005, when the London Bombings Relief Charitable Fund came into being after the 7th of July bombings that year, quite at that point an absolutely unprecedented event in terms of its scale and immediacy and the number of people who were affected by it, LBRCF was set up to distribute what came to be £12 million. And when that job was done, it closed down. But the model was actually the only one to respond to those sorts of incidents. So, of course, in 2017, we know there were, in the end, 4 terrorist incidents in London. So when the Westminster attack happened, and then London Bridge, Finsbury Park, Parsons Green, we were doing the job again as the London Emergencies Trust, a new charity but a successor body with the same overall objectives and aims. So when the Grenfell fire happened, the partnership we already had with the British Red Cross as our fundraising partner, London Emergencies Trust as the distribution end of that, with a particular specialism in assisting those who are next of kin, for those who lost their lives and those who were injured, whether that was just a short visit to A&E or something much longer. We were there doing the job. We had the experience back from 2005 of working with families, with next of kin, in very, very difficult circumstances for them. The rest of us can, I think, only imagine some of that. The model that we had was there and ready to go to help people caught up in the Grenfell Tower fire.
Okay. David, do you wish to add anything?
Just briefly, so the link from City Bridge Trust through to that work was manifested in 2 individuals, one of whom was able to be seconded for 18 months to work with Gerald and others, and he is still on my team and was seconded to inform this particular response, and also gave some advice to the Manchester events. And through the trust we also supported the learning piece after 10 years to make sure it was all gathered and not actually lost in terms of corporate memory. So that was there ready to be activated, albeit in a very different context.
Well, it's fair to say that really that's the model from the modern day 2005 that broadly we follow in subsequent tragedies that occur in terms of where there is general fundraising and others to distribute to victims and associated families. Okay. Can I just go, I suppose, to Sarah Atkinson, if I ask you a question around, so how did, if that's the model, and we heard that Manchester has sort of adopted it in terms of the arena issues, how did the Grenfell Tower tragedy differ from other emergencies such as terror attacks, and what's made it so challenging?
Thank you. So obviously all emergencies are different because they happen in a different context and to a different community. I think the particular features from our perspective that we'd say are distinctive about Grenfell, firstly it was that the number of organisations that from the very beginning were involved, were asked to respond or stepped up to respond. Most of the previous emergencies we've seen a natural focus emerges either from an existing organisation that's ready to respond, or a focus naturally falls around a single organisation that steps forward. We didn't have that in this case. We had a number of charities and organisations involved from the very, very immediate aftermath. I think we'd also, from our perspective, identify the uncertainty and the confusion around the number of individuals affected, that pervaded for quite a long time. Uncertainty in the immediate aftermath is very normal, but the length of time that persisted was unusual in our experience, and that really affected how charities were able to respond and the nature of the response. And then I think the third thing that it's very important to highlight in the context of Grenfell is the lack of trust in state agencies and the way that spilled into particularly the larger charities working in an auxiliary capacity, but more broadly the public uncertainty and lack of trust around how much money was being raised and how it was distributed. And that context of lack of trust and uncertainty was much more acute than we've experienced before around a public response.
On various emergencies, would the legal considerations change, or would there be a core legal parts, and there may well be fringe issues that would guide the distribution of funds or the fundraising activities. I know we're going to come later on about crowdfunding and your pages on everything else, and there's some issues around that. But can you just give us a sort of paint some pictures around some of those complexities around some of the legal background in terms of approaching?
So in the broadest sense, there are two kinds of funds that are raised in emergency situations. One is charitable funds, donations to registered charities or appeals organised on behalf of registered charities. Those are charitable funds. They're under the jurisdiction of the Charity Commission and the courts as charitable funds, with all the responsibilities that relate to that, and the trustees of those funds are responsible to us for managing those. Gift aid and other tax reliefs normally apply in the way that they do to charitable funds. The other stream, broadly speaking, is what you'd call person-to-person donations. These are the kinds of individual responses, for example, for a particular family or a particular individual that have been raised, often online, but traditionally this has been happening for centuries, communities collecting in pubs informally around streets for those individuals. And those are not charitable funds, those are gifts given as freely as if I gave you money today from me to you. There's no jurisdiction of the Charity Commission usually, or the courts around those, and the tax reliefs are not usually applicable. What can happen, however, and this is where it blurs, is where an individual, without realising it, because of the way that they've raised those funds, may create a charitable trust. So if I appeal to you today to give me money for the victims of the Grenfell fire, I may inadvertently be creating a charitable trust. I don't mean to do that. I don't want to be the trustee of those funds with all the responsibilities that comes, but I may inadvertently do that on the terms of those fundraising. And we saw appeals that were intended as a natural human response to support victims that inadvertently became charitable trusts in these situations, and that's where we have to get involved and help those individuals who didn't mean to create that trust but may have taken those responsibilities on and need to fulfil them.
If we continue with the... Sorry, Andrew, do you want to come in on that point?
Very quickly, actually, to Mr. Oppenheimer, if I may. Do you self-activate, or does somebody ask you to do your work?
It's a bit of both. Back in 2015, as we came up to the 10th anniversary of the 7th of July bombings,
Our Assembly member has jumped the gun, but please continue.
I'm so sorry.
Please
I
continue
did scan the other ones
to answer the question, because it's quite an important one. But it's quite important.
Oh, I apologise. We'll
That's
come back
fine.
to it
I'm in
later.
your hands.
I'm sorry.
It's an issue for us.
Back in 2015, as we came up to the 10th anniversary of the 7th of July bombings, as well as working independently with Emma and colleagues at City Hall to organise a 10th anniversary event for that one, some of the former trustees of the 2005 fund, you know, we looked at the world around us and thought this might happen again. So what we ought to do is put some infrastructure in place, which became the London Emergencies Trust, ready to activate if something happened, as in the end it did in March 2017. We also talked to the head of paid service here and senior staff here about the arrangements to do that, and that if something happened, in part to help the fundraising, in part to help the profile and the knowledge that there was a charitable organisation in existence which would channel money to those affected, we arranged that there would be a statement by the Mayor to help launch that in the wake of, as I say, what happened on the 22nd of March. So it's a bit of both, self-activation and then formal activation.
Thank you for that. I suspect you're going to get a similar question a little later from...
Okay, if we just continue with just some of the context, can I just go to Zoe? So Red Cross, credible international experience. So how does that differ when you're doing a sort of domestic type emergency situation? Just to paint some pictures in terms of the issue of raising and distributing some of the monies that were given to you. So what's the challenges?
First thing to say is it was quite an unusual situation. Essentially, we hadn't raised money for a domestic emergency since 7/7. And our involvement in Grenfell came off the back of First Manchester happening, and I was working with the Mayor's office there to establish the We Love Manchester Fund along the same lines as the LET, and then the London Bridge attack, in which we set up the Solidarity Fund with our partners here as well at the London Authority to be for beneficiaries of that. So it's not a typical scenario. What happens in an international emergency? I mean, operationally in the UK and internationally, it's quite similar in the fact that our volunteers are on the ground straight away. And in the case of Grenfell, we were, as part of the resilience plan, were immediately involved. We're in the West Way. We then set up a friends and family centre, etc., etc. So our operational involvement was continual throughout that. And that would be the same as an international emergency. The key is who we partner with. So in an international emergency, essentially our partner is the national society of the country. So, for example, when there was a tsunami in, forgive me, when there was a typhoon in Philippines, which had a huge storm surge wave, it was the Philippines Red Cross that we were raising money on behalf of, and they would distribute the money appropriately. In the United Kingdom, we need to partner with the authorities, so with the relevant local authority or with the national government. And one of the situations here was that it was quite difficult to get hold of the local authority to have the conversation about fundraising. And once we did, we made the offer, which was to launch a fund. I think that was on Thursday morning, eventually, to launch a fund, to distribute cash, actually, which was turned down, to set up a friends and family centre, which was accepted. And to set up a support line, which was also accepted as well. We already had a support line running for Manchester and London Bridge, so that would be a way of ringing up and saying, I need some more information, including how can I access the funds that are being raised on my behalf. So I think one of our lessons is that we would exercise a greater right to initiate ourselves in future. And there was an expectation amongst the public that we should be raising funds. Our supporter care line, our supporter, sort of like a customer care phone line that you ring up, members of the public were calling us saying, we'd like you to raise, we want to donate money, can we do it through you? Partially because the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea named a local charity in the initial days, but then also because of the lag in getting in touch with being able to get in touch with the chief executive. There were other players that came into the field. The other thing to note as well is that in the case of both Manchester and the UK Solidarity Fund, the local paper got behind the British Red Cross fundraising. So in Manchester, the Manchester Evening News immediately set up using a crowdfunding platform, a form of raising money. Once the official We Love Manchester Fund, which was between British Red Cross and the Mayor's office, was established, they then channelled their funds into that. Equally with the Solidarity Fund, the Evening Standard partnered with us. That didn't happen in the case of Grenfell, in part because of the time lag, I think.
Okay, thank you for that. Let's go back to Gerald, and I think so you might come back in on this question, but Robert, you may have something to say. So I think in terms, just so the techniques, we've got background information about the parity of funding for victims of societies, and we're probably going to go into a bit more detail about this later on, but just setting the scene. In different disasters, they're all tragedies and they're all terrible in their nature, but they're slightly different. So in terms of is the parity of funding for victims and survivors in different disasters a desirable aim, or do some disasters mean that you adjust and have to adapt? How does that? What's the thinking about that generally, rather than specifically about if we're facing different emergencies? So, Gerald, do you want to?
I'll start. The challenge, I think, for any charitable fund distributing money that's raised is that you never quite know how much you're going to get. So you have to be very careful as a trustee and indeed as an officer supporting the trustees early on not to overcommit your funds and not to overpromise, because that would be the worst thing to do. Well, we promised you 10,000 but we can only give you 5 because it's not there. That is just terrible. You don't want to go there. So inevitably you end up setting some tariffs, if you like to use a really rather cold-sounding word, that say, well, we'll pay a certain amount for injury, we'll pay a certain amount for next of kin. But we were very clear in 2005 and again in 2017 that as more money became available and we had greater certainty of what we could do, so we would increase the payments that were made. These are all charitable gifts, as Sarah was saying earlier on. So you also want to try and treat people in similar circumstances of loss or injury in a broadly similar way as best you can, but with a caveat that Westminster had its own fund. As Zoe was saying, the Solidarity Fund later came into being to support London Bridge and indeed used for Finsbury Park and Parsons Green afterwards. And then, of course, Grenfell, on top of that, had a completely different fundraising stream attached to it. And bringing Manchester into the reckoning as well, huge fundraising success in Manchester on the back of that incident. And of course, all the funds end up with slightly different sums of money in them. So your aim as a distributor over time is to try your best to equalise what you award so that someone who is next of kin from one incident is ending up with broadly the same amount of money as someone in another incident where the fundraising was much higher. And certainly we had to do some work both with the Red Cross and colleagues at the Charity Commission to make sure that Westminster, which had the smallest pot of money in the end, we were able to do some transfers of funds, the Red Cross was within the Solidarity Fund, to bring awards in Westminster up to the same level. So in the terror sites, we broadly achieved that, and those at Grenfell, well, we're a bit ahead of that. So it's a balancing exercise. You're constantly on a tightrope to try and achieve that, but the aim is parity.
And yes, just to add one of the consequences of that attempt to try and get parity with the uncertainty about how much money is there is when you add into the equation uncertainty about the number of people who, the number of fatalities or injured, where that's changing quickly, you then have a complicated bit of financial management, which is you need to make sure that if, as you increase the payouts to those you know about, you need to set aside an amount of money so that at any point in time, when those numbers firm up, you can make the same level of payments to them. And that makes sense when you explain it to people, but when we began sharing data through the Charity Commission about the distribution, of course, from the point of view of London Emergencies Trust, we had a stubborn amount of money that seemed to just be sitting inactive, which we were having to hold on to until at Grenfell the number of fatalities was clear. And that we had to explain that to many times to people who quite rightly asked, why is that money not going anywhere?
That's quite crucial because that time, the ascertaining of the final number takes time.
Yes, and we had to
of a Grenfell type situation.
Yeah, we had to sit down at the start with our board with the best available data from the police, from the media, from NGOs on the ground, and model around a certain number of fatalities to be blunt. And we set aside money to pay in case of up to 100 fatalities. When the figures were clarified at the end of the year, then we could take that money and redistribute it accordingly.
So is there anything you want to add to that at this stage?
The other thing that I would add as well is when we come to it is that we've had a lot of conversations with the London Emergencies Trust about as we release the funds. I think British Red Cross has raised £7.2 million for Grenfell ultimately, which is something that we're very proud of. We were thinking about as we were making decisions about how we could make the best contribution regarding in terms of distribution, what our key focus could be. So, for example, we've really weighted distribution around people who've been bereaved because we're aware that potentially that is one group who haven't received as much money. Who when you look at the balancing out of how the different pots of funding is being distributed, that was one group that we felt there would be a kind of finite time when they continue to receive support, whereas there might be more ongoing support for others. So that, I mean, in a way, there is some positives in terms of having a number of different pots in regards to that. And having a distribution body that's been involved with various of the fundraising bodies has enabled LET to have a bit of that sight in regards to how things will actually play out.
Okay. Just looking to members before we move on to our next set of questions. Is there, Assembly Member Bailey.
Just maybe to Rob and maybe to Red Cross as well, and maybe you and Gerald. You talked about a sum of money and having to pass all that money up because you didn't know how many victims there would be. But what effect does the actual tragedy have? So if you compare the Grenfell situation to Manchester, both are very tragic, but at Manchester there was no loss of homes, for instance. There was no need to house people or contain them in that short period. How does that affect how much you plan, how much you give, or what you give for? Or is it just emergency there and then you're giving for that sort of 5, 10, 24-hour period?
I think that, as Gerald has said already, that the specific focus and expertise of London Emergencies Trust is dealing with people who have lost loved ones or been injured. It became apparent very quickly that there were people who didn't necessarily fit into those categories or had also lost property possessions, and we were aware that there were people able to get some money at that time. But as people have said already today, it was slightly disorganised. I think other funders are maybe better than us to talk about the money that was raised and how over the weeks that ensued it became clearer that there was a growing need amongst survivors who weren't bereaved or injured, who had lost everything and couldn't get access to money. In other words, there were problems with the distribution of that. And it was beyond the capacity of London Emergencies Trust at that time to step into that area, and I think it took a couple of weeks really to get organised and work out a strategy between us about how we distribute to all of those groups. In the end, the picture sort of simplified into London Emergencies Trust distributing to the bereaved and the injured, and Mark and colleagues at Rugby Portobello Trust distributing to the survivor households. But behind that distribution was a whole process of working out who fell into that group.
Okay.
Yeah, just to say, for us, right from the get-go, the early hours, our focus was on survivors. We opened our doors at 1:30 in the morning. And so within 8 hours, we were able to put cash in people's hands and clothes and things like that. We launched an appeal internally to our donors who we knew, and we raised £118,000 in about 5 hours. So we were able to make sure that people were supported immediately with emergency cash, to get taxis to hotels and all that kind of stuff. And then colleagues at Kensington Chelsea Foundation came in very quickly after and gave us £30,000 to distribute straight away. It has to be said, though, with a note of caution, we are not a grant-making or a distributing organisation. We are a local youth charity who run a youth club and various activities to support the community. So the people that were doing this distribution were we have 20 staff on site, and we had 100 volunteers who turned up who we knew. And it was those people we set up a very crude system. But we are embedded in the community, so our idea was that we knew people and that we asked survivors to self-identify one another. It was absolutely not perfect, but in those early hours it was the best we could do, and then it went on from there into something a bit more sophisticated later on.
Can I just comment on, there's something that was going on at that time which is really critical. There was an absence really of trusted data about the number of people who had died and about people who'd been displaced or injured. And at that time, I think London Emergencies Trust was working very intensively with the police. So we felt that we were as confident as anybody in understanding what we knew about fatalities. And we were able to get going quite quickly because we worked very closely through the police in exchanging information, finding out where there's a bereaved family and so on. there was a lack of information about who was in that building, who survived, and what counted as a household. And in the absence of that, several organisations were piecing together the best available data and triangulating, and I think it's fair to say that Rugby Portobello were doing that and had as good a grip on that as anybody. So you had two organisations willing to distribute with reasonably good data that we could be confident in and ready to get going quickly. But there was no hard data at that time. It was changing every day, but we knew we needed to get going quickly.
Okay, let's move on to our next set of questions then. That's a very valuable context, a bit wide-ranging, but setting some of the scene for our more in-depth questions.
Yeah. Okay, I want to focus on the relationship between the London resilience and bodies and the raising and distribution of the donations. We know that there are certain distinctions between the tragedy which happened in Grenfell. It was geographically isolated part of London. There was a delay in taking a view this was a London-wide response was required. Who makes a decision? And what is the criteria for declaring that a London-wide response is required? Well, let's try to start with you, David. What's the criteria for making a London-wide response, and who makes the decision?
I think that's a civil response. It's local government who would decide that rather than charities. It's not charities who would make that call, it's government who would do that.
Who would make it then?
Well, I think, I mean, I can only talk as I was doing in answer to an earlier question, that the discussions that we had before any of the incidents happened in 2017 with senior staff here, both head of paid service and with Emma's team, was that in the event that something happened, in order to support the fundraising effort and after that the distribution effort, a statement by the mayor or the mayor's office to the effect that a terror incident, which is what we were thinking of rather than the fire, would prime all that, and indeed after the Westminster attack that is what happened, so that we and the Red Cross as the fundraising partner could get going, and the Red Cross could approach donors, could respond to the public, and we could get the distribution mechanisms into place and activated. So we did it that way. We weren't technically reliant on the declaration of a civil emergency or anything like that. We sort of recognised it when we saw it in that sense.
So the answer to your question is it's the authorities that do it essentially.
So the sense is that the charity bodies were looking towards the mayor for the declaration.
No. So the local authority will have they will have a strategic coordinating group, and each local authority has a resilience plan. The Red Cross is written into those resilience plans. So the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea did initiate the strategic coordinating group. Essentially, it's a phone call with all the authorities on there, the Red Cross are on there, and they start to manage the actual incident straight away.
Yep. So that the London Resilience team coordinate that piece initially. It's normally, if it's a major incident declared, it's normally the police that will chair that group. It involves all of the operational bodies that are involved and whoever is actually relevant. So depending on the incident, it could involve the Met Office, it will involve the NHS, it will involve the local authorities, police, fire, ambulance, and that's the coordinating body that sort of gets to that incident piece. That
the local authority get it right. Did they think this was a London-wide response required? Because we've heard from this committee that there was a delay in that happening. What's the role of the Gold Command?
I know there's been other meetings that covered some of this topic off, but the way that process happens, I think, is reasonably well controlled, and everyone is clear on what their roles are with that. So the local authority will raise that initially. As it became clear that the Grenfell incident was becoming more serious, and it was declared as a major incident, that's the police then hand over on that piece, and that's where that sort of machine comes into operation.
I just want to pin down here. Was there a delay with the local authority declaring the London-wide response was required, or was there no delay in that?
It's a perception point. For me, my personal view is that
I'm just looking at back in history,
with the benefit of hindsight, and what we now know about the scale of the tragedy, yes. The London
the London Local Authority gold sort of solution should perhaps have been brought in earlier, but that's with the benefit of hindsight. And it's worth noting that it felt like a long time in the process, but we were talking about, these meetings were happening every 3 or 4 hours from the point that the
So
tragedy
when the
happened.
decisions are made, right, what's the criteria used for declaring a London-wide response? What is the criteria that's been
I
used?
think we need to clarify in terms of the London-wide response in the sense that of bringing you all together as you're developing in a very fast-flowing, complex situation where organisations have had to adapt to the needs on the ground and to others come into play. If we have a model in 2005, should the post-recovery plan, if we can call it that, in the resilience models that we have and the gold, include you in a much more clearer way than what I think is apparent. I think that's what the member's saying. And it's one of the questions the member will follow up is the issue about the coordinating role of the Charity Commission of bringing people together and setting some coordinating framework over your work.
The strategic...
Sorry to interrupt, but I just wanted to get some clarity into that.
I mean, certainly back in 2005, again, the history here is that the then resilience plan that existed in this building had the capacity in it for a charitable response. And when the 7/7 event happened, very shortly afterwards, and the then mayor set up what was originally called the Mayor's Fund, which very quickly became the London Bombings Relief Charitable Fund. It worked very well, and our LBRCF in those days had direct access to Gold Command. The chief executive went on to it, and that worked extremely well on a whole range of situations that developed there. This time, the response was, as I've said, looking just purely at the terror attacks first. We activated, in the way that I was saying earlier on, after the Westminster attack, and then when London Bridge happened, when Finsbury Park happened, when Parsons Green happened, we were already there and doing the work with the Red Cross, with others, and so those events, one after the other, followed a pattern from the original activation. And because through Rob and the London Emergencies Trust team and the British Red Cross, we had access at that point to the police and all the NHS standing behind that and the local authorities and so on, that all worked. Grenfell was a bit different because of the nature and scale of what happened, as colleagues have said, and it took a little time for that to get rolling. But in answer to your question, I think the experience we've all had is that if you're going to do contingency planning for a future event, one of the big bits of learning is that because charities together have a key role in delivering services on the ground, distributing, raising money, distributing it, having a presence on a Gold Command is going to be really, really helpful and important.
So can I add to that as well, that actually British Red Cross were called into Gold on the Saturday by John Barradale, and we stayed in there for over a week. So, you know, we didn't have a formal coordinating role with other voluntary sector organisations, although we tried to have as many conversations as possible with everybody. So there are mechanisms. It's about how effectively they're deployed in every case.
Just from on the ground, actually, I think it feels like we're still waiting for it to happen. They're being quite honest. In those early days, there was lots of talk of gold and things going on and all the rest of it. And that from where we were sitting, there was an absence of leadership. There was an absence of response from government, both locally, nationally, and London-wide. There was a total absence. There was a void, and that's why organisations like us, like Clement James, like the Harrow Club, like all of those other local organisations, moved in to fill that void. And it was entirely uncoordinated, entirely. So, you know, I don't want to get into an emperor's new clothes kind of situation. We were just doing our thing, supporting people on a human-to-human basis, and waiting for the civil response to catch up. And in many ways, I think if you speak to survivors, that is their absolute experience, and it is ours.
Let's bring in David, then I'll bring in Assembly Member Berry and Assembly Member Navin Shah.
So my experience was I was asked by John Berridell on the Sunday to go into the Gold Command structure, and that was by dint of being my day job as director of City Bridge Trust, which is charitable. It works with 500 or 600 charities across the communities of London. And there was something very strong about the fact of the breakdown in some quarters in trust and confidence in the public bodies, and actually coming from that constituency, the community voluntary sector, rather than the statutory, was of value. What I found there, I mean, yes, the Red Cross were there with that hat on. I think in terms of the future, there are lessons in terms of the connection between the local community voluntary sector and the national, which is key, and I know there is already some work being done on that. I think there's also something very key about in resilience response, just the language, the way that actually the statutory sector operate in resilience response was a very unfamiliar language to me, and I was sort of suddenly in a world which was unknown to me. So I think in terms of future planning, the community voluntary sector could be better equipped rather than this language of gold and platinum, and which doesn't mean much to us, although within the emergency service and in first responders it's it's bread and butter. There's something about how the different sectors can work together in advance of the next, heaven forbid, situation.
Can I, obviously we had a whole meeting where we discussed in some detail, and we had a very steep learning curve in terms of gold and what happened when and all of that, where we talked about how how long it took for the gold management side of things to spring into action. But here today we're really trying to get to the bottom of when the official fundraising appeals were set up, and I don't think we have yet. I think Zoe from the Red Cross has said people were contacting you trying to give money, wondering if you'd set up an appeal yet, and you needed the permission of the local authority for that. And obviously the local authority they took their time triggering the London-wide gold response themselves, and so didn't give you permission for a number of days. London Emergencies Trust, I'm not sure it's completely clear whether or not you were able to set up like an official appeal until you'd got some permissions in that respect as well. Did it need to wait until there was the London-wide gold thing triggered, or is that a separate process? Can you, on what day were your official appeals actually set up?
The partnership we have with the Red Cross is already there. London Emergencies Trust is not a fundraising body. We distribute, and that's where our expertise lies. In terms of the fundraising that happened, as Zoe was saying, the Red Cross was on it pretty instantly and was asked to get involved on that basis. I mean, quite quickly, again, something we haven't talked about yet, but in concert with both the Kensington and Chelsea Foundation and indeed the Dispossessed Fund through the Evening Standard and the London Community Foundation, there was a very quick exchange of views and information there. And
Can you tell us what days those different appeals started? Because that is the crucial thing. It's like there seems to have been delay on the ground of some days during which people felt very abandoned, and so just to get clarity on the timeline would be great.
We're a very small locally based charity, and we had a phone call. Well, I saw the disaster. We were set up with our fundraising appeal at 11 a.m. that morning, and we went live on 3 platforms, and within 1 month we raised 5 million. We're now at 6.7 million, and we were the first. I know that because those first few hours ticked by very, very slowly indeed, and suddenly that money started to flood in, and with a team of 4, it became a heavy responsibility. What are we going to do with this money? And we felt there was nobody for us to talk to apart from our local community partners. So we were quickly on the phone to Mark at Rugby Portobello, to Clement James, to Westway Trust, to Almanar, Notting Hill Methodist, I probably missed 1 or 2 out, the Harrow Club, and we were able to get cash out by the Saturday when people were saying, where is the money, why isn't it getting out there? And that was our first response. Of course, you can't go on giving out cash like that. And so pretty immediately, in fact within days, we sat around the table with a charity commission, probably 3 or 4 days if I look back on my diary, and they were fantastic in terms of coordinating the main funders. So that included the London Community Foundation working with Evening Standard Dispossessed Fund and the Red Cross who'd come in at that point. And we came up with distribution methods fairly quickly. The issue, as Rob says, was pretty much around the data and how we were going to distribute the funding. But if we look back on the timeline, and we promised money, so 17th of the 6th we got 110k out, We promised on the 23rd of June, when the Prime Minister said that people would be offered housing within 3 weeks, we said, we'll respond to that and we'll get 10k per former household out. Of course, that didn't happen, but I believe we responded as quickly as we could under the circumstances. And without the local element, working with Rugby Portobello Trust to get the money up to survivors, I still don't know where we'd be now, frankly. I think the money would still be sitting there. And having the London Emergencies Trust set up and ready to go was absolutely fantastic. So I think collaboratively as charities, we worked as effectively as possible under the circumstances.
Sorry to, because I'm trying to focus on the raising part.
Right,
We've got lots of questions about distribution.
Right, so we've raised 6.7 million. The first month we'd raised 5 million. It's tailing off obviously now, but we are still getting donations of about 2,000 to 3,000 per week.
What about the Red Cross then? Because you said a bit ago that you wanted to collect money immediately, but there was a delay. When did you manage to get your appeal?
So we got agreement to launch from the local authority on the Thursday, and we launched on the Friday. That was partially because we had a conversation with the Evening Standard, who'd already launched at that point. About how to coordinate in regards to that, and so we did ours on the Friday morning, so that we were trying to again at that stage already coordinate between ourselves so that there was clarity. But those were the three biggest funds. Am I right in saying that? There's the Kensington Chelsea Foundation. When you went first because you were asked to by the local authority, is that right?
No, we were asked by London Funders,
right,
the umbrella body for civil society, and London Emergencies Trust.
Right, and then the Evening Standard sought to partner with the London Community Foundation, and then British Red Cross came after that. So both the Evening Standard and the British Red Cross would need a distributing body as well. So you need the fundraiser ourselves and the distributing body, which is London Community Foundation and the London Emergencies Trust.
I just want to bring Sarah in, in relation to...
I've confused them.
The Evening Standard appeal launched on the Thursday.
We launched on the day of the morning of the fire. So there was a phone call from the Evening Standard, which is the Wednesday.
Wednesday.
So there was a phone call. We have a long-standing relationship with the Evening Standard. We run the Dispossessed Fund every year, picking a particular issue affecting London's communities and raising and distributing money to grassroots. On the morning of the fire, so we received a phone call from the Evening Standard who said, we want to launch a campaign. Do you want to partner with us? As a senior management team, we got together and then discussed with our trustees whether we did. We did, obviously. And the appeal was launched pretty much straight away online. In that first day, we raised about £500,000. Second day, it was about 850,000. Third day, about 700,000. So it was very, very quick. And we distributed our money via London Emergencies Trust and Rugby Portobello Trust as well. We're not a local actor, so we are a pan-London organisation based in Brixton. So we had to have those conversations. We had to go to site to figure out what was going on the ground and how we could get that money out.
Can I just bring Sarah in, because Sarah has got a fixed time to go. So Sarah, just in terms of...
So briefly on the pace of fundraising, so looking back at some of our records, so we chaired a conference call, which many of the groups here and the others that we talked about were on the Friday lunchtime at 2:00. And part of our goal in doing that, as well as to convene the conversations that were already happening, but to make sure that they were happening as coordinated a way and that we could support, but also to get our sense as the regulator a grip on the fundraising issues, because in previous disaster situations we've given advice on how the public can give safely, but where there's been a single focus of appeal, we've been able to give advice that giving to that appeal will be the safest and best way to get funds. It was clear already by 2:00 on Friday that there were significant funds raised across several appeals, and I'm looking at a briefing that we sent into government on the Monday morning, and by that point we estimated that from the reports that we'd had and from other reports on crowdfunding, our estimate was that £10 million had already been raised. So the pace of funds raised was fast, but it was not around a single focus. There was already considerable funds with several appeals, and so it was clear at that point that trying to direct and consolidate public gifts into a single place was not going to be desirable, was not going to be possible. We already had funds in places that we would need to support, and that's really from that point where the unusual role that we took, the convening role, which colleagues have already described that we took, really started because of those separate significant sums.
You originated that call.
We
You
did. So
originated.
and there were already conversations happening. And in all honesty, I cannot remember whether someone said you call a call or we're going to have a call. Can you chair it? But we called. We had information that we needed as the regulator around giving safely. We were already giving individual bits of advice and support to charities
But
on.
you were the body that
their
concluded it would be a
responsibilities.
good idea to have such a call, and you organised it. Is that
And,
correct?
and yes, and as I say, other calls and conversations were happening, but that call at 2:00 and then the subsequent meeting that we held at our offices with many of these groups on the Wednesday was really where the collaboration and the coordination started to take shape. And our role as the regulator, and we had to be extremely careful here because we had a regulatory job to do, but we also wanted to convene and support the dialogue that was happening and make sure it would facilitate that collaboration. And
One
clearly
of your primary motives for that must have been about trust and confidence in institutions and what's happening with the money and distribution of.
Absolutely. So it was clear that we'd got organised charities who were being who were managing significant sums of money that they weren't previously managing, that they weren't, as Mark and Susan have said, not what they were set up or had expected to do, but had stepped up to do it. Cash was already being distributed. As a regulator, ask for forgiveness, not permission is not normally our watchword, but actually in this situation, money had got out to people who needed it, and we needed to be part of helping those charities make sure they were okay about doing that.
Just for clarity for this part of the table, that role, for those who are aware of the gold, silver issue, is almost like a charity version of the gold, silver command issues of trying to get to grips with that. Would that be fair to say that role was your equivalent to that approach in terms of this disaster?
Not sure how complementary that necessarily is. It was.
Right.
I think Sarah's right. It was a collaboration
Yeah.
that came from people who instinctively wanted to work together, recognised there were some gaps opening up. There were some issues around data, issues around how we cooperated, and I think Charity Commission, their instincts reflected those of the group who were distributing, which is we need to work this out and we need to, as much as we can, align what we're doing on the ground. So it wasn't a command and control, it was more of a collaboration really, albeit with a regulator in the centre.
And we were very conscious.
Command and control, it all makes
Yeah.
sense in times of emergency.
We were very conscious that while as the regulator there are requirements that we set down for charities, these were also independent charities with their own responsibilities, and we in law can't direct trustees. So we had to both, as the regulator, you're both an authority, and also you have to create space in which charities can do what charities are supposed to do. So it was both enabling and enforcing all in one go, and there is an element to which we look back and can make sense of it, but at the time everybody was doing what they thought needed to happen.
Okay. It's Navin Shah, and then I'll bring you back to you on.
Yeah, it is about the process. Obviously, depending on the nature of incident, Gold Command kind of practices can be different and are different. From my experience, when Gold Command is it becomes operational, led generally by police and local authority, they would also incorporate local faith and community groups to take their advice and have their input. I understand that there was no such role played by the various organizations from charities and people who have expertise in this field. Is that true? And do you believe that there should have been that role given right from the outset, so that you don't lose vital time in coming together?
Yeah. Me to answer that. The faith groups embedded in the community stepped up in exactly the same way that Mark and Susan have described their organisations doing. So they were absolutely in the mix from the beginning. Again, there was a significant fundraising strand through the National Zakat Foundation.
But were they or were you at any stage invited to be party to Gold Command, or that never happened?
So I can't speak to whether they were invited directly. In terms of the Charity Commission and Gold Command, there was informal contact and conversations through people we knew and through organisations we knew, London funders. We did seek to have a more formal engagement with Gold Command, particularly around the data issues and some of the information needs, and also seeking to reflect to Gold Command, from our perspective as the regulator, some of the trust issues and how that was hampering proper response on the ground and distribution of money. It was difficult. David's role was for the voluntary and civil society, not for the regulator. We should have had a better direct route as a statutory body, but we didn't. And so we worked with David and through David. And again, that wasn't conventional, but we had to work because we had to get it done. Eventually, about 3 weeks in, there was a more formal role for us in Gold Command. My colleague, our Chief Operating Officer, attended meetings and we put formal requests through. And David is still involved in the transition, post-transition.
How long did this take to happen?
About 3 weeks, I would say, until we had a kind of modus operandi that was more formal than the informal. But it took a few days for us to be having
It have been sooner. Should there be?
Yes, it should have happened sooner. It would have been better.
So I think there's a couple of points. Back to that local national point I made earlier, and I'm sure that within the response that Red Cross are doing to this and other of the disasters and emergencies, I think there is room for improvement in terms of how the structural piece, the community voluntary sector is actually represented within that space at local level. And also through the independent trust and foundation piece, which actually turned out to be not so much for this today, it'll come later, but in terms of the coordination of some of the organisational funding responses. So I think in terms of actually how it happened in this instance in Grenfell, there was a woman on secondment from DCLG called Hilary Patel, whose day job was working with faith and community organisations, and she was actually tasked with being the liaison between those groups on the ground. In terms of how effective was that, she was doing her best within difficult circumstances, but I think structurally that could be improved.
Can I add to that?
Sorry,
Might I add to that as well? I mean, one of our reflections at the Red Cross was, first of all, to recognise that we were already under a huge amount of pressure. We only have so many emergency response volunteers, and they'd already been deployed in both Manchester in response to London Bridge. So there was a bit of focusing on we called in people from across the country to come and help at Grenfell. But in any emergency, what will always happen is that the local community mobilises first, because they're literally there on the site of the emergency, and you rush to help your neighbour, the person that you know, or just that you don't know but's physically close to you. And the local organisations, including the faith groups, did a fantastic job and were there, day in, day out from the moment the fire happened. And one of our reflections as the British Red Cross is that it did take us too long to reach out to the grassroots groups, and that is something that we are working very hard to rectify and think about how we do things differently, because we have this extraordinarily well recognised brand and this ability to convene people, and that people look to us to be a way of showing their kindness for people experiencing crisis. And there are other organisations who might have different or better expertise in terms of their particular local community that we need to proactively much earlier collaborate with in order to genuinely reach the people in crisis more effectively.
I think they've answered the question. My question was that the Grenfell Muslim community grew up from their organisation, from their community, and the Charitable Commission played a great role in helping them become much more regulated. But how did the big charity organisations like the Red Cross engage with this faith community? I think you've already answered the question that we have a lot to learn to do in that event. Thank you. Sorry?
Say locally, we were working very collaboratively with not just local faith communities, but within hours, within 2 or 3 hours, we have a school on site, and we'd already decided to close the school. And within that, we've got Humanity First, Muslim Aid, a whole raft of organisations from all faiths across London who turned up and were hosted in our building and just joined the community effort. And we were liaising with the Almanar and other faith groups locally because we knew one another and we knew each other's phone numbers. We didn't have to search for it, and we could have that conversation. So actually, we kind of, in the absence of anything else, we kind of organised ourselves a bit, really.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, let's turn to Assembly Member Bob.
Ms Atkinson, can you update us on the total amount raised to support the survivors of the fire at Grenfell Tower and their families?
So we have been publishing regular updates on funds raised, funds passed to distributing organisations by fundraisers, and the total distributed, so that's in the hands of survivors and those in need. We've been doing that since August, and again, that's unusual. We wouldn't normally do that. We haven't done that in previous emergency situations, but we did that because the public concern about the amounts raised and distribution and the pace of distribution, and the need as part of our coordinating role to step up and give some information around that, to reassure the public that money was held properly and moving at the right pace. And colleagues have already described some of the reasons that money doesn't move as quickly as you might expect it to in these situations. And so we have been publishing that on a regular basis since August, at first weekly. We've now moved to fortnightly because the pace of change of figures isn't so fast. And the last update we issued on Thursday last week was £26,532,564 raised overall. And that's charitable funds, so that doesn't include the funds I described earlier that are person-to-person gifts for individual families or pupils of particular schools and so forth. That's charitable funds under our jurisdiction. Of that, 22,349,470 has moved from fundraisers to distributing organisations. So the vast majority is now in the hands of distributing organisations. And of that, 20,944,310 has been distributed. So the vast majority of those funds have been distributed. They are with the individuals, the families, the survivors, the next of kin. There is still some money yet to be passed to distributing organisations, and there's still some money with distributing organisations yet to be distributed. And colleagues can talk to any specifics, but broadly speaking, the bulk of the money has now gone out. The pace of funds raised has slowed to a trickle, but has not stopped. So there are still funds coming in.
Between different releases of information, actually the amounts declined. Is that an administrative error?
So, as I say, we don't normally publish these kind of very regular updates, and one of the reasons that there's a downside to doing that is that there can be occasional fluctuations because, for example, amounts pledged that don't actually come in. There can be estimates of gift aid that don't materialise because a donation didn't turn out to be eligible for gift aid and it had been expected. And because we've tried to map all the funds raised, there's been the occasional inadvertent double counting. For example, Just Giving reporting a sum to us that they've passed to one of the organisations, and the organisation reporting the same sum. We've tried, and the organisations have tried to winnow those out, and we've been very accountable every time there's been a fluctuation, but there have been occasional fluctuations in those sums.
Which organisations raise the bulk of the funding?
So the biggest fundraising appeals are the three we've talked about. Donations to the KNC Foundation, and that was largely direct appeals that were set up very quickly after the fire. The partnership between the London Community Foundation and the Evening Standard has been very significant, and then the Red Cross is the big fundraiser for the London Emergencies Trust, and those are the three biggest. But there's also been significant fundraising strands. For example, the Artists for Grenfell, which people may be familiar with, and the charity Single. Significant donations that have gone directly to the National Zakat Foundations, donations directly to Rugby Portobello, which is not a fundraiser, but people appealed to donors and people gave. But those three are the big chunks, the three big chunks.
You must have had experience of other such fundraising, emergency fundraising
efforts. Were you surprised by the community's response to this emergency?
No. I mean, different, as colleagues have described, different emergencies raise different amounts, and no one is ever in the business of predicting what something will raise. But the nature of the disaster, the community's reaction, the clear need, both for support for survivors to help them in the immediate aftermath, and also the impact on the families, and all of this played out very, very publicly through the media. We weren't surprised that it was significant sums. As I've said, the difference really that we observed in this was that there was not one single focus as there might previously have been. There were several significant appeals, and colleagues have described the relationship that panned out with the focus from London Emergencies Trust on the next of kin and the injured, and the focus through Rugby Portobello for support for survivors. That took shape over a lot of hard conversations and hard thinking, but that's broadly how it panned out. But that was part of trying to make sense of a lot of money that needed to go to people in need, and the need to work out how to do that in an empathetic way.
If I can broaden this to some of the other fundraisers here, perhaps Red Cross, and can you tell us how quickly those donations came in, and when did they peak, and when did they start to peter out? Is there a sort of
I don't have that information in
predictable
front of me right
profile?
now, but we can get back to you with that.
Perhaps anybody else?
I have some of that data. So it's important to clarify actually that whilst we worked with the Evening Standard Dispossessed Fund, we also received the money from Artists for Grenfell and donations that were received through that appeal, and also the money from the Game for Grenfell, half of the money from Game for Grenfell. So our total amount was about 7.9, of which 6.7 was Evening Standard, and there are others which I can provide data for. But in terms of frequency, the speed of donations, on the 14th, so the Wednesday, we received £509,000. I'm rounding up a little bit. The next day it was about 856,000. Then it was 702,000 on the 16th of June. Then it dropped dramatically to 189,000, and it stayed in and around. So it dropped to about 100,000 for the next.
When did it drop to 189?
189 on the 17th of June. The day after the 18th was 93,000, which I think was a Sunday, and then it bumped up again to 129,000 on the Monday, and 177,000, 129,000, 141,000 on the 22nd of June, and then it started really going down, 76,000, then it went right down to the 20s and 30s and £1,000 basically. We can provide that data to you.
That's an unusual profile, isn't it? Why it went up, down, and up again, and then down again?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it's attached to the sort of the media profile and what's happening on how much news coverage there is. The first day, people are digesting the situation. The second day, people understand the magnitude of it and donated the highest amount that we'd received, and the day after that as well. And then as time goes on, the donations are more from, not necessarily direct to us, but from other people who are fundraisers who are giving their pot to us, essentially.
I think it's quite unusual because that was the Evening Standard Dispossessed Fund. So what you would see is when Evening Standard run a story in the paper on a Tuesday night, on Wednesday donations would rise. So that explains the unusual activity.
Yeah.
So it's more about media activity.
It absolutely is. So that's what we saw in Manchester, which was the first of the series, which only happened over a 3-week period. It was the first attack, their children were affected, and then an international pop star decided to have a benefit fund for it. So the amount of media coverage of that was huge. With the UK Solidarity Fund, the terrorist attack happened on the Saturday, and then on Thursday was the general election. So the coverage waned for that, and we managed to raise a much smaller amount despite launching a PR effort called Saturday Night for London to try and raise funds. But with Grenfell, the media coverage went on for days and days and days and days, and that really does drive the donations. It's effectively free advertising for the fundraising.
Yes. We don't have a day-by-day account because we weren't actually capable of producing one, but at the end of week 1 we'd raised 3.4 million, so that was 1 week in. The next time we looked was on the 7th of July, and that was 4.5 million. 14th of August, 5.75 million. 21st of September, 6 million. And then 14th of November, 6.4 million. 15th of January, 6.7 million. And I don't think our appeal was affected so much by the media because we weren't partnered with the newspaper, although the Metro did donate to the KNC Foundation for at least the first 3 weeks after Grenfell.
Is that information you have shared with us or can share with us on the profile of donations?
Oh.
Yeah, thank you so much. Perhaps to Miss Abrahams, you took on the role, excuse me, coordinating the gifts in kind.
Mm-hmm.
What challenges did you have in that?
So that was the role that we were asked to take in terms of dealing with the tremendous outpouring of compassion where people had been moved to empty their cupboards and bring physical belongings to the site was a considerable challenge. It was something we were asked to do by the Royal Borough of Kensington Chelsea. We have a retail outlet, so we have over 100 stores across the United Kingdom, so we've got a kind of logistical operation and capability to do this. There were 211 tonnes of goods distributed. That's the equivalent of 3 football pitches worth of goods. There were, so that part of it was sorting. So what we did was there was around 40 tonnes of goods that had come directly from stores, brand new. They all went straight to the Humanitarian Assistance Centre Westway, and they were distributed by other organisations, by the local authority. And then we sorted through the rest into goods that could be sold. And frankly, there was quite a lot of goods that weren't of sellable quality at all. We sorted through those goods in a warehouse. We had hundreds of volunteers come and help us to complete that task. Those goods were then taken, tagged to be specifically for Grenfell and put into our stores and then sold. And every penny that was raised went into the London Fire Relief Fund. So that raised around, I think it's over £200,000 in the end to go into the London Fire Relief Fund. And in addition, actually, we had people come into our shops, and we had around £50,000 worth of cash donations that came via our shops as well. So I guess one of that's the role that we played, and one of the difficulties that we faced in that was understanding and support from media and the local community about our role in dealing with those goods. You know, one of the questions that we were asked was, who's given you the right to do this? Well, we were asked to by the local authority, and the question is, if we hadn't have done it, who else would have done it in terms of distributing those goods? So it was the right thing to do, and to a certain extent there was a little bit of opportunity cost for us, because all those volunteers that came in to sort the goods for Grenfell weren't then working in our stores, helping to raise general funds for other British Red Cross work, both in the UK and across the world. It was absolutely the right thing to do, and we had the capability to do it, so we stepped up.
What was there didn't appear to be any communication going out that more stuff was not going to help, more physical goods were going to help.
Yeah.
Why was that?
So that would have been the requirement for the local authority to say that. In those first days, the majority of the goods came in the first few days. Well, certainly there was a large volume of them anyway. I mean, that we know the series of events that happened, and that, you know, an additional Gold Command was brought in on the Saturday. So it was the communication with the community was the responsibility of the authorities. At that point in time, the British Red Cross hadn't been asked to help distribute the goods that were being donated. That didn't come until a week or so. It was the week commencing the 19th we started having the conversations, and then operationalised after that.
From the 19th,
we started to talk about that. There was a meeting with the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea to say, we've got all these donations, we don't know what to do with them. Could you help?
You went to them or they came to you?
There was a meeting, I don't know who set it up.
There was a point in those early days before the Red Cross were involved where I remember Kensington trying to push out comms messages that they didn't need any more things. I can't remember what exact point that was, but it was definitely in that first few days when it became clear they had a lot of donations.
We were putting that out within 5 hours. You couldn't move on Walmer Road. It was like literally down the street. We were trying to get that message out in 5 hours.
Of donations.
No more donations. I mean, you know, we're talking thousands and thousands of packets of nappies and things like that. It was literally down the street. And actually, many London mosques turned up to help us clear that away. And that was on day one. Just people just turned up, sorted it and took it away in vans. You couldn't get up and down the street.
There were some people who were clearly in need of clothing and other physical items and couldn't access them because they didn't live in Grenfell or had moved to a hotel and had no proof of address. Is that a situation you recognise, and how did it happen if it is?
We predominantly almost entirely worked with people from the Tower. Our resources were focused on that, and anyone from the Tower, from us, we were very fortunate in that, in terms of clothing and stuff like that. We had lots of retailers across London who sent lots of new stuff to us, and we had an army of volunteers who were helping people get that within hours. And I know that was a similar situation for other local organisations. But we were helped as well by Google, Apple, Dixon Stores Group, who got everybody back online and gave everyone phones with free contracts. And we set up a pop-up shop round the corner that actually was staffed by Apple and lots of volunteers who got people back online. There was a whole kind of coordinated effort, and the issue of ID isn't one that we recognised because we kind of knew just about everyone in the Tower, but if anybody turned up for assistance with clothes to us or anyone else, they would absolutely have been helped.
I just think, following on from Zoe's point, in terms of distribution, I think it's important to know that 165 households who received money from the Red Cross via Rugby Portobello were told in the late summer, early autumn, that of the money they were receiving, £1,000 came directly as a consequence of the sales of those goods as well. So that information was passed on as well.
What is the Mayor's role on the ground in relation to these kind of gifts, Ms. Strain?
So one of the first things that we did, so in the strategic coordination group in the morning, I made clear to that group that we had the Team London volunteering resources.
Which morning? Sorry, I missed.
The Thursday morning.
Thursday.
The morning after.
Morning after.
That we had Team London volunteering resources that we were very happy to deploy and could be deployed very quickly. And as has been discussed in here already, we struggled to get Kensington to actually come back to us on whether they wanted those resources and when and how we would help with that. So in the end, I'm just going to check my dates, sorry. So the offer was made on the 15th, and then over the following couple of days, we also reached out directly to Kensington to see if we can get them to engage on the topic of volunteering particularly. In the end, they came, I also went to the LLAG, the Local Authority Gold Group, made the same offer. In the end, Kensington came back to us on Monday the 19th to say that they would like some support, but that support was actually more for community liaison and comms support as opposed to the donations, which obviously by that point the British Red Cross were looking after. In the end, the Team London volunteers provided community support, provided support from the 20th of June to about the 30th, and we deployed 168 volunteers over that time frame. I think for me, looking at learnings, there needs to be kind of quicker and better deployment of resources in a more, because the Kensington were overrun with people wanting to help, but with volunteers, you need people to coordinate that resource. So Team London have that ability, the Red Cross that have that ability, and we're both working together with the London Resilience team, and there's a subgroup that deals with the voluntary sector for that place to kind of think about how we improve that in future.
Thank you. Ms. Abrams, would you concur with that, and is there anything else you want to add as to what the Mayor could have done at the time? But there was no communication from the Mayor to stop the flow. You were expecting the local authority to do that, is that correct? So, why do you think so many people opted for online crowdfunding? What were the issues, and what were the issues with the crowdfunding? Perhaps Ms. Abraham.
I think what we saw last summer was these horrific events, but also the amazing spirit of the British people, their kindness. And it's a spontaneous response when you see somebody suffering to try and do something to help. People could clearly imagine themselves into the situations that these people living in the tower and around there were in. It was, you know, and because of the nature of the fact that it was on television, it was on social media, the fire went on for such a long time, it was unsurprising, and in some way one of the kind of positive things that you could see about humanity rallying around. So people will want to take action themselves. Some people will want to set up their own fundraising. Other people will choose to donate via a well-known brand. Other people will seek out a local organisation because they believe they will have the experience and know-how and trust of the community, which was very clearly the case with Rugby Portobello, to be able to be most effective. And, you know, we live in a digital world. And so people are used to raising money and doing everything online, and we need to be, as a charity sector, to be as agile and responsive as people are in the rest of their lives.
Mr. Oppenheim.
Just wanted to add to what Zoe was saying there. My day job as head of policy at the fundraising regulator, working with charities, we're engaging with the Charity Commission with fundraising platforms because they have a variety of different forms. Some of them are commercial companies, some of them are registered charities, and all stages between, to try and get some better regulation and better messaging in there so that the public has good guidance about what happens when you decide to donate through a fundraising platform. You have to be very sure where the money's going. If you name a charity, if you name the British Red Cross or the Kensington and Chelsea Foundation as the end recipient of the money that you collect, that's very straightforward because there's an entity there that can be seen and the platform can transfer the money with the gift aid if appropriate. If you're just saying, I want to raise money because I want to help, and you don't specify clearly where the money goes, that's very clearly going to cause problems, and some of the issues that came up in Manchester and at Grenfell and to a lesser extent at London Bridge and Westminster meant that everybody had to work very hard to decide where the money should go so that the donors were getting what they wanted, clarity about helping people affected by the fire at Grenfell, but making sure that the money went through a route that would ensure it got there. There's a lot of work we have to do on the regulatory side, the fundraising regulator and the Charity Commission, to make that a better reality so that people have greater assurance about the safety of the donations that they make and that they encourage others to make. It's, as Zoe was saying, it's a new form of fundraising. It's getting bigger and bigger all the time. Nobody wants to get in the way, though, of the generosity that people are expressing when they do that.
Just go back a little bit of a stage about some of the timings. When we kind of know that everybody was working really hard. I'm just trying to get an idea of the timeline and who activated this. So Miss Abrahams, when did you approach or was it you that approached the local authority offering assistance, or did they come to yourselves?
We approached them.
When did you do that?
It took us a while to get hold of them. The actual conversation ended up happening on the Thursday.
On Thursday, you had tried on the Wednesday to contact them?
Yes, and we were actually, so effectively, because we're part of the resilience forums, we're on an operational level, we were already in conversation. It was about having a conversation with the chief executive around our fundraising capability as well, and offering that as part of our capability. And what we've said in the past is that we need to be asked to launch a fundraising appeal. So, and as I mentioned earlier, we'd want to get, in future, we may take a right to initiate without being able to make that where things are failing, which was, it was a very complex situation, and the local authority was struggling to manage everything that was going on.
So you called the local authority. Did you call the Mayor's office or the Greater London Authority as well?
Well, Emma and I were already talking because we'd been working together on the London Bridge, so we were in constant communication, and actually, ultimately, Emma gave me John Barradell's phone number, which I passed to my Chief Executive so that we could have a conversation. So that was a very helpful facilitative role
What was that?
That was playing. That was on that part of it was on the Friday.
All right. But prior to the Thursday, when you finally got communication with Kensington and Chelsea, you're saying you were trying to get communication with them. Did you try and get hold of the GLA as well prior to Thursday?
We're already talking, yes.
Sorry, you were already talking.
So that it's the local authority that we would need to have the conversation with about offering to raise funds, and we actually offered to distribute funds.
So you were talking to the GLA on the Wednesday about the possibility of offering assistance. Is that correct?
Yes, but that we were talking, but the actual conversation that we needed to have was with the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea as the responsible body.
Right.
We were, to be honest, from the strategic coordination group and the discussions that happened afterwards, we were all attempting on a variety of different topics to attempt to get Kensington to engage and give us some decisions on that piece.
Can I just clarify? So, in your relationship, is that because they're the responsible body because you're built into the resilience plan? Because that's the key issue for you.
Yes.
Because everyone else can come in and Linda Val can say, actually, I want to get on and start doing some things.
Yeah.
But it's because you're in the resilience plan named, you take your lead in the conversation from them to do X.
We have a special status, so we're not an NGO. We're an auxiliary to government established in Royal Charter. So we have a relationship with the authority. That's the same in any British Red Cross Red Crescent society around the world. It has a specific relationship, and we're guided by our fundamental principles of humanity, neutrality, impartiality. So we exist in part to help surge when there are emergencies that are so big that the authorities are struggling to meet the humanitarian need, and that's where we can come in and provide assistance.
Okay, thank you. Sorry.
Yeah. So you were in communications with the GLA. You had tried to get hold of the London Borough, Kensington and Chelsea. At any point, did anyone from the Strategic Coordinating Group, which was set up at 5 a.m. on the morning of the tragedy, had they tried to contact you at all?
So we're on the Strategic Coordinating Group in terms of operations, which is why, during that on the Wednesday night, on the night the fire broke out, we had our volunteers at the site providing humanitarian support, and so that includes emergency response volunteers, and then very specifically we have psychosocial support volunteers who are people with, for example, a clinical background who are able to help people who've been traumatised. So we were physically, in terms of operations, humanitarian operations, taking it by its strictest definition, we were involved right from the outset.
So you were part of the Strategic Coordinating Group as per the London Resilience Partnership Strategic Coordination Protocol. And that caused you no problem. In there, it kind of infers that it's the decision maker, doesn't it? Or were you told to wait for the permission of the local authority before you did any work?
We generally deal with the operational side and the fundraising side separately. Our focus would be on the people in crisis and what practical help we can give them. And then the conversation would generally be at a leadership level, which is what happened in, for example, Manchester. We'd seek a conversation with the leadership of the authority to say, we think that there's a big public response and desire to give in relation to this? Can we work with you to fundraise? And particularly, you know, one of the conversations we'd be having there is we've got expertise in fundraising, we do it, it's part of our humanitarian response, and we can handle issues like, for example, the fact that, you know, we understand that there needs to be a distributing body, we understand how to phrase the terminology when you launch the fund, all those kinds of conversations as well.
I very much appreciate it. I don't expect you to remember right now, but you contacted the Kensington Chelsea on the Thursday, then communication started. I would really appreciate if you could let us know what time that was. I'm not expecting you to remember straight away, unless you do. That would be great. Mr. Oppenheim, when was the first call that you'd got on to seek assistance, or did you make the call?
Gosh.
And who from?
Well, we were already working with our fundraising partners at the Red Cross, and I can't tell you the time or exactly when, but we certainly had a very early conversation with the chief executive at the Red Cross about what was going on and the fact that the Red Cross had been activated to fundraise, as Zoe has been saying.
Forgive me, would that have been on the Wednesday or the Thursday?
I'll have to check, to be honest. I can't remember off the top of my head, but it was very early on. If it wasn't Wednesday, it was Thursday, so it was 24 hours or thereabouts, so that we could bring our expertise to bear, because it was becoming very apparent very quickly that there had been loss of life and that people had been injured. So we were given our what we were doing at the other sites already in existence, an obvious place to go to distribute charitable funds in those circumstances. But we'll check the dates for you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Farnsworth, you were saying that people were speaking a language you didn't understand when you were dealing with, to paraphrase, when you were talking to the local authorities or authorities. What kind of clarity would you have been seeking?
So I think actually in terms of just the goal command structure, which I think this committee has now a deeper knowledge of, and some of you have particularly deep knowledge of, that wasn't something that I was personally familiar with. So in terms of actually understanding that, the side of A4 that actually says what that is, and actually a greater awareness in terms of the community voluntary sector in times when there aren't emergency situations, such that when they do happen, it's not a great surprise, this sort of language, because it could take on a sort of mystique attached to language which is unhelpful on the ground. What is goal doing, sort of thing. So it's an area of officials and first responders and British Red Cross who are very familiar with this language, but personally it wasn't something I'd encountered before, although by dint of the relationship between City Bridge Trust and the City of London Corporation and the experience of the 7/7 bombings, I was familiar with the broader resilience piece.
So were you familiar with the London Resilience Partnership or the protocols?
So by dint of different roles I was familiar, because in terms of by dint of the City Bridge Trust relationship with the 7/7 bombings and also the London Emergencies Trust, I'm a trustee of that London Emergencies Trust, so I was privy to that aspect of the conversations, and then by dint of my role as chair of London Funders, of which every London borough is a member of, again, I was familiar with work in this area, but I hadn't personally engaged in any of the resilience exercises or anything in terms of preparatory response.
Just finally on general, well, thank you for your indulgence. I just wondered if there's a general awareness of the strategic coordination protocols set up by the Mayor of London. Is there an awareness of that out there now?
In a general sense, yes, because that's what we've certainly always talked about from the time that we decided to put the London Emergencies Trust into place as part of the response. So that's meant engagement with officials at City Hall to make sure roles were understood and what we could deliver was understood. So we've been doing that and had that general awareness, if not detailed involvement.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair. Sorry about that extensive question.
Let's move on to our next set of questions. Assembly Member Berry.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think we want to talk now about the distribution of the aid that was provided, who it went to and when, if that's okay. In terms of the money that was raised, if we can start with the London Emergencies Trust, who I think you said previously you'd basically been set up to support bereaved people and injured people because of the sort of background of that in relation to terrorist attacks. Do you know how much of what proportion of the money that's been raised has gone out in those kinds of sort of bereavement and hospitalisation type payments?
Yes, I can give you a figure across all 5 incidents if that's helpful. So since March we've worked in five incidents and we've made awards to 215 people.
I'm just asking about Grenfell, if you can.
About Grenfell,
yeah.
Sorry. We've made awards to 71 fatality cases at Grenfell and 59 injury cases. So they are people who were injured and hospitalised for different periods of time.
You've given out £90,000 for every fatality, and that's more than usual because of the higher donations.
So far, yes, and we are beginning now. We've been working with Red Cross over the last few days around this to increase that tariff to £100,000 per fatality.
And then people hospitalised for a week or more, £30,000. That's also higher than usual.
It's the same now. Takes us back to our parity point as the 4 terror sites. So we've managed to get parity there. So across all 5 incidents, if you've been hospitalised for a week or longer, the payment level is £30,000.
This money that's gone out to people, the bereaved families, but also people who are injured, did it go out in one go, or have you added it in tranches?
No, it didn't. And at the start, Gerald described some of the complexity of not knowing either how much was coming in or ultimately the number of people you're dealing with. And so that has been a management challenge and a communication challenge, because at no point have we unfortunately been able to say to a bereaved family, this is the sum that ultimately you will get. We began with clarity saying we know what an initial payment will look like, and we shared that information widely in the first few days and weeks. But broadly speaking, over the last 6-7 months, we have increased the payment levels every month. So we began, for example, in the case of fatalities, we began in July, £20,000 per fatality, and that went up to 40 in August, 60 in September, 90 in November, and will now be 100,000. And that's been challenging because it makes financial management difficult for those recipients. What we've always, and we communicate in generally with bereaved families through the police, family liaison officers and the key workers attached to them. So, and we indicate that more money is likely, we give a rough sense of how much and when, but we can't unfortunately give specific details months in advance.
Okay, yeah, that makes quite a lot of sense. Do you know how much in total has been given out in these kinds of payments?
Yes, we've given out just about £7 million now.
Okay.
Of these kind of payments. We gave a further 773,000 went to survivors.
I'll get on to survivors in a minute. I'm just checking these one by one,
yes,
if that's okay. So that's £7 million out of £20 million, nearly £21 million that's been distributed so far in those kinds of payments.
We just to be clear, we had just a little over £8 million to distribute to bereaved and injured at Grenfell. Most of that came from the Red Cross, but also, as you've heard, from London Community Foundation and Kensington Chelsea Foundation.
Okay, great. We've got a table here of the distribution, and sort of trying to move on to the survivors who had not, I mean, there's a crossover. Some survivors were injured and hospitalised, and some were not, but there were a lot of people, I think it's 255 families, who were made homeless by the fire. And those are the ones who've, I mean, certainly as an elected representative, taken up much of my time trying to work on the practicalities of that. And I think according to my table here, I'm looking at the rugby Mark from Rugby Portobello Trust, there are payments that have gone out to from your trusts of cash to all of the families who were displaced, and it wasn't based on injury or anything. Was that distributed equally to all families? How were you determining their need when you gave them payments?
I can be very, very honest with you. We put a call out to our donors. We wanted physical cash. So in those first few hours, people turned up from right across the borough and in fact parts of London and tipping up their purses and stuff, and we had over £100,000. And it broadly went something like this, the conversation, because it was human to human. How many people are in your house and how much do you think you would need? Some people say, I think I need £500, and that's what we gave them. It was just that we didn't have a criteria. We just worked with people broadly based on their needs and said, because we knew most people were going to go to a hotel, we said we're here tomorrow. Because it's things like, if you're a size 3.5 shoe and we've only got 5s or 2s, we've got no shoes. It's that kind of stuff. So we were just really practical about it and worked with people on a very individualised basis.
That's really good. On this table, though, there are lines that come under you having distributed it. There's a line that says £10,000 for every household from Grenfell Tower and Grenfell Walk, from the K&C Foundation fund, and further funds from Carolina Hardy's Just Giving Appeal. And that, so you did that? You gave out £10,000?
That came to us. In total, if it helps, we've given now a minimum to people, so individual households in the tower. We've given out just over £83,000 in total to each individual household as a minimum. And to people from Grenfell Walk, £30,000 as a minimum. And they are minimum figures, because in those early days after the fire, some families had £2,000, some families had 400 quid. Some people managed to get out, like we were offering people assistance, and they said, no, I've got my bank cards and I can work and that kind of stuff, I don't want any money. It was very individualised, but broadly they're the figures. So we were doing distributions for Kensington Chelsea Foundation, British Red Cross, and in the very early days after the fire, Evening Standard Dispossessed Fund, who asked us to distribute £1,000 to every family, and then a couple of days later, another £1,000, yeah.
Okay, that's really useful. And you're confident that you had all the families on your list? I mean, there weren't any missing people? Or...
We think we have, yeah.
Right. And was that from the beginning that you had them all? Because, I mean, as far as I understood it, there were various different aid organisations. You managed to get a consolidated number together quite quickly.
Broadly, since within a week of the fire, we think we got about the right number, and since then we've had 2 additional families that we've made payments to, where there were very individualised cases where people were getting divorced and stuff like that, and were not living as one family and that kind of stuff. But yes, because the families themselves, the people from Grenfell Tower, worked with us and were coming to us every day, and we, within hours of the fire, Grenfell, what's now become Grenfell United, have got quite a definitive list of the missing and who was in each flat and that kind of stuff. We've got reasonably reliable data.
Okay, thank you. There's another line on our table that is a grant of £15,000 to each of the households from the Tower and £8,000 to the Grenfell Walk households. That's on you as well. Is that separate, or is that just it happens to be on 2 lines?
It's in with that 83,000. It's those figures amount to that. It's kind of like there's another line on there, from the Art for Grenfell, 1.9 million. That was something that they raised. They gave to us on the Thursday, and we distributed that in its entirety on the Friday.
Was that given out in sort of cash payments to survivors as well?
No, it was all of these larger figures were into bank accounts, and we helped people who'd survived the fire get their bank accounts sorted out within...
When I say cash, I just mean money rather than actual cash,
Yeah, directly into bank accounts. We did physically give cash.
Yes.
And then, but the larger amounts have all gone to backs, or through backs, or faster payments.
Okay, and people who didn't have bank accounts or had lost their stuff, you helped them set up new accounts?
We helped them set up, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. So, moving on to the next set of people, then there's the community groups who are helping, and you're one. You said you initially raised some of your own money directly from people you already knew. Then you started to receive money partly to distribute, partly to spend on your own activities. There were lots of other community groups around the place doing work, looking after people. There's a very diverse community there. There were groups from different cultures, different types of community centres, serving different populations. Were you also the people sort of on the ground helping to direct funds and practical things that were needed towards them? Because that seems to have been, when I went to visit on sort of the 19th, 20th, and then later that month, those seem to have been the more problematic things to try and get help for.
We were talking to other people that we knew, but in the immediate days after the fire, people facilitated a really human response, neighbour to neighbour, person to person, and set up little groups of their own, and were working with quite defined groups of people, or indeed with the broader community doing different things. And our role, right from day one, was that we said our focus was going to be supporting survivors. So we weren't doing community infrastructure stuff. We weren't working with people from the broader Lancaster estate. We have a staff group of 20 people, and we were keeping our building open just about, not short of 20 hours a day, with staff and volunteers. And we said to the survivors, they wanted somewhere safe, where they knew there was going to be no press, and forgive me, they knew there was going to be no politicians, and they knew there was going to be no sort of hypersensitive media attention. So we said, this is your building, we will work with you. You come in. So we didn't need to ask for ID and all that kind of stuff. It became their base. We worked with survivors exclusively.
Okay, so you weren't really doing any distribution to other groups around the area. So my question, I guess, to the rest of the panel is, how did they get support? Certainly, I think when I visited, there were identified needs emerging. I think notably for counselling in the wider community, for support for children's activities who'd been disrupted with school and things like that. And really translation was an issue that I found very difficult to get sorted out. I tried to liaise via the Red Cross people on the ground, just thinking they seemed to be the right people. I tried to sort of move by the Mayor's office. In the end, a small group of people who were worried that the official information that was going out, and we all know the rumour mill that there was, and you know, the difficulties. People without English as their first language needed to see the official information, the legal advice from sort of inquest and the information from the Red Cross in their own languages. In the end, that group had helped them get a tiny grant from another funder that I know who's not related to any of you, and they did manage to do that. They had a lot of volunteer translators, but they needed to fill the gaps in. But they did that sort of themselves. So I can't see on this table much support going out to the wider community that outside of Rugby Portobello.
Most of the work to wider communities is not detailed in this. It was funded through coordinated efforts through people like London funders and other trusts and foundations. It didn't. Most of that money, in fact, I don't think any, came from what was raised. It came from institutional funders.
So the 20 million has primarily gone to survivors and families. So I think, David, you have your hand up. So I think moving on, because there was a grant fund set up by London funders. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah. So on that point, I mean, there was an early awareness that what was being given out to individuals, there were a lot of organisations whose day job was totally put on one side to respond to the immediate emergency. And there were early conversations which involved London funders, the then director of London funders, and also conversations with DCLG through Gold Command to try and actually get some resource in a simple way to be accessed by those organisations. And that's, there's a lot of detail on that. I'm not sure whether you want that today. We can get it to you. I thought that was actually being considered later at one of your sessions or something. So, but in terms of the independent funder community coming together with some statutory money to actually get money out and working together, there was significant work done by London Funds, but also with John Lyon's Charitable Trust on the ground, particularly on the children focus, and a list which we again could get to you in terms of different foundations working together through a single point of entry, and then linking with people on the ground in terms of accessing that money.
Yeah, so when was that fund set up?
Again, I don't know the exact date, but I can get that to you. It was £1 million that the DCLG made available to distribute through that initial central pot. And I think from memory, again, I can confirm the exact dates. There were 4 tranches of payments made out to organisations through a kind of infrastructure fund, and then there were separate collaborative funding efforts, particularly focused on children and a couple of other aspects. But there's a whole sort of raft of information on that, which is actually easier to document and more readily available. But again, that was something which I think in terms of future planning could be anticipated. It was something that emerged rather than actually it being sort of triggered by the structural piece.
I mean, we've got, things like support for Moroccan women, Arabic-speaking women. There's a centre that I visited. A couple of months later, they hadn't received any grants. They'd not really had any information on how they could get grants. And with Deputy Mayor, we sort of gave them some information on how they might do that. But they'd been running, all their staff had been doing overtime. They'd been running on, volunteer time. They'd really pulled out all the stops, but these organisations...
Is that the Moroccan Women's Centre?
Yeah.
They did get a grant.
They did, I think in the end they did, but it was
pretty early on actually.
To
the
keep,
funding for community organisations, I can't remember the timing either, but certainly for young people's activities, those were during the summer holidays, which by definition are mid-July, so it happened pretty quickly, the community funding.
That's good. I mean, I'd like to see a report on that, because I think
absolutely
that is something we could have planned better for, and I think potentially people giving, I don't know if Zoe has a view on this, people giving to the fund, the charitable funds, may have imagined that money was going to go towards the healing of the community, the support of the community, the humanitarian support, more than it might have been going into sort of grants to the individuals affected.
So you can only use the money for what you say on the front of your appeal it's being raised for. And I guess people will be limited by that in regards to how it got set up. Just a few points that I would make as well, which is that in that phone conversation that happened on the Thursday between Chief Executive of the British Red Cross and the Chief Executive of the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea, the Red Cross did offer to distribute cash, and that was not taken up. That is something that we do in an international context.
Distribute cash to local groups?
Yeah. Well, no, to people, yes. I mean, to survivors, to people in humanitarian need, essentially. In terms of communications as well, several of my team went to Gold on the Saturday when it was moved to there and started proactively taking on almost an auxiliary communications role. And that was particularly in terms of social media in regards to sharing information about how you could access support, including advertising our support line. And again, that is somewhere where members of the public, those affected survivors, could get in contact and find out information. I mean, the other thing that I'd like to say as well is that part of the role that the British Red Cross has played has been in reuniting families. That's something we've got strong expertise in as the largest provider of services to refugees in the country. So we've put £100,000 into bringing families over for funerals or to be in touch with people who have been affected by this tragedy.
Really good. So you're saying that the fact that the appeal said for the victims, essentially we will give the money to that restricted in charitable terms what the money could be used for. It couldn't be used for the wider support that was supporting the victims but wasn't the victims themselves.
That's my understanding of how charity law works. I'm sure Gerald can confirm that exactly. Yeah. What's also interesting as well in regards to this is when we've been thinking about this latest distribution, we did have a conversation with Grenfell United, who are sort of an organisation, a self-mobilising organisation of survivors, about whether or not they wanted us to, for example, focus the next distribution on children who'd been affected directly. And they were ambiguous about that. So we've attempted to have conversations with the community. The community are diverse and are not as one necessarily. So making decisions is complex in regards to how to best steward this money that the public have given.
I think that's correct. Gerald, can I ask you a bit more about that? Because I think potentially the London Emergencies Trust, there are aspects of this emergency that were perhaps not covered by the immediate fundraising effort. is that something you might change in future? And how do you respond to criticisms that some of the aid reaching people was a bit slow potentially?
Okay, I think as we've said, our role very clear. It's to support the next of kin and the injured through making charitable gifts. And as we've said, there've been British Red Cross, Kensington and Chelsea Foundation, London Community Foundation, and a few other small contributions as the primary source for that. I think the trustees' view there is that we stick to what we're good at there. We did make some money available through Rugby Portobello to get to survivors, and that was, again, as a part of the discussion that was going on with the Red Cross, with RPT as the distribution arm for that. But we have a clear view that that's where our remit is. We don't have a view at all about the use that individuals who get the money, we don't have a view about how they use it. It's up to them. It's a charitable gift, pure and simple, and we act within our objects to do that, within our charitable objects. That's absolutely clear. So in terms of the speed of distribution, as Rob was saying earlier on, this is complicated. What we learnt as a result of 7/7 is that families, particularly where there's been loss of life, next of kin, particularly in cases where people are more seriously injured, the money isn't the first thought. It comes along, of course, and it's helpful and welcome, particularly because the way we do it, it's a gift. We don't mind what you use it for, not our call. It's there to support you, and we're the vehicle that helps express public generosity to people in severe distress and need. So that's the way we look at it. Certainly at Grenfell, some of the money, and again Rob can add to this in a second, some of the money went out fairly speedily. We built it up over time, but there have been a significant number of cases which were very, very complicated. For example, where the next of kin was a minor, and actually what you're talking about here is putting money into trust so that they can draw it as they achieve their majority. There are cases where there may be questions over the capacity of the person who is next of kin. So very, very complicated arrangements to have to put in place, working with people who might, for example, have to be named as guardians for the person you're putting the money in trust for, engaging with different family circumstances, very large dispersed families, not all necessarily in the UK either, in other European countries or in North Africa, typically where Grenfell's concerned, where sadly in some cases, as colleagues have mentioned, families had broken up and you had different legal advisors representing different parts of of the same overall family, where we've had to broker arrangements. So that of course takes time, and sometimes that makes it appear that money is moving slowly when there are very, very clear cases why not. As we were saying earlier, there was a perception that we were not distributing all the money we had, but that was because we were providing for a greater number of fatalities in particular than were known early on, and that only became clear at the end of the year. And as soon as we knew that the number was 71, we could release money into the system. We could always be better at communicating all of that. Those aren't easy messages to get over, but that's what we sought to do. And I think that's a good lesson learned.
That you need to be thorough, but also that the speed did seem to be rather slow. The headline figure that came out in August, I think, was released by the Charity Commission, was that only, I think it's 10th of August, only 15% had been distributed. And that, even if you're thinking about the uncertainty that you're talking about, it seems rather low.
But what we're doing, where next of kin are concerned in particular, and where people are in hospital, we do, in order to act responsibly and fulfil our duties as trustees, we do have to have some evidence for that. And as we referred earlier, some of the data to do that was very slow in coming and didn't help any of us get the money out as quickly as we would have liked. So where you're dealing with next of kin, you need some basic evidence and that the person that you're going to assist is indeed the next of kin. So we follow the Intestacy Act 1925 as the key bit of UK law to underpin that. That sets out a hierarchy of relationship where it's not immediately clear. But because of particular family circumstance sometimes, you couple that with trustee discretion about what the best thing to do in the circumstances is. And it does take a time sometimes to establish that. So it may appear slow, but actually we were moving at the pace of families on the one hand, and at the pace of the data and the evidence that we needed to support the awards on the other. Do you want to add to that, Rob?
That's very comprehensive and reflects our experience on the ground. My main concern for the first fortnight was in the cacophony around the money available and the noise and the information and misinformation. Would we be able to communicate with those who were bereaved or injured so they knew they could apply? But we were paying out within 3 weeks to bereaved families. And we were doing that by working with the police, with the key workers, making sure that they all knew and were sharing that information face to face, which incidentally was, in my experience, a much more effective way of communicating in that context. We were passing written material that was disseminated in other ways, but we felt the relationship-based flow of information was much more reliable. So within a few weeks, we had a high volume of applications. We were beginning to pay out, and then, as Gerald says, we were trying then to go at the pace of the family and the police and doing the work. There were very few cases actually that stalled because we couldn't track down documents. Okay. Very few.
I think that's fair enough. And quite a lot of this seems to stem from the fact that you're treating these payments more like bequests, aid. And Mark, you've got your hand up. Right?
Yeah.
Because you were just giving out money.
We would have been able to do more, but we'd not been asked, and two, we didn't think it was our role, and three, we were quite reticent about it because of all the noise around mistrust and so on, and we were part of the community. But within a couple of weeks, people like Kensington Chelsea Foundation, even some of the dispossessed people were saying, could you give £10,000? We didn't have a grants team, we had youth workers and volunteers. And Rugby Portobello is a local charity, but it's also part of a larger national charity, which is based up in Derbyshire. We merged 10 years ago, but Rugby Portobello Trust remains intact. So within a week or so of this, we started to think we might have to. And then we went to a meeting with the Charity Commission, and they told us in late July that they would like us to be the single distribution point, and can you go away and build a grants team? And that's what we did. But there was a slight complication in that London Emergencies Trust have got dispensation that if they make a gift, that it doesn't affect people's welfare benefits or pensions and tax and so on. And we were not part of that. So we very quickly made sure that we were. So we were kind of dealing with those really practical issues. And also there was this issue about, if I get this money, does it mean I'm not going to get a house? If I get this money, does it mean the borough are off the hook and all that kind of stuff? I
think we've got down here that it took until the 4th of August for the DWP to confirm that payments wouldn't affect people's benefits, so you can see that was...
Yeah, that's right. And then you will see after the 4th of August that payments really escalated, and we became a single distributor, and we had a very straightforward way of doing that, so we didn't need any further ID and all that kind of stuff.
So just finally, we have got an awful lot of money that's been donated via the Red Cross, who are a humanitarian disaster relief organisation providing things on the ground. We're all very familiar with the work abroad, for example, and that's the kind of work that was needed for very many displaced people. And yet we've got the London Emergencies Trust, who are, by necessity, because of the objects I think that you've got written down, giving out essentially insurance-type, bequest-type payments only. And I think that might be an issue. And I think, did you say the London Emergencies Trust was essentially set up under the Mayor's jurisdiction? but is now independent. Is there something that the Mayor's office could do to change the remit so that there's more more of the money donated after events could go to humanitarian assistance?
The Mayor's involvement back in 2005, after 7/7 happened, in the shock of that day, was to launch what initially for about, well, I don't know, just a few days was referred to as the Mayor's Fund, but when set up in law very quickly became the London Borough's, the London Bombings Relief Charitable Fund, with independent trustees, because that's what charity law requires. And from that moment on, LBRCF and then London Emergencies Trust, when it was set up, independent charities completely, with their own trustees, their own decision making. But of course we work in concert with all the others who have involvement, as we've been explaining this morning.
You were distributing funds collected by these other bodies as well,
Yeah,
so your restricted remit restricted what could happen.
Indeed, and that's based on what was done in 2005, the historic experience of that, the evaluation of it at the time, and as David referred to earlier on, a 10-year look back in 2015 at what worked and why actually in 2005 it worked really, really well compared to other similar sorts of funds around the world responding to disasters, which often have ended up in legal horrors, which thankfully we never have and haven't to this day. So, you know, we have that model. It works. It can always be better. Of course it can.
Yeah.
Perfection takes
it's not
longer.
a criticism of how well
No,
you
I
worked
understand
according
the
to your
question.
original
It's
remit. I'm just
it's very-
can I ask Emma whether, because one of the things we've talked about is, you know, the likelihood of other things happening in London that are not, you know, this is a fire, we've had terrorist attacks, there have been floods due to burst water mains, but there are other types of floods that could happen in London, severe weather events. You know, there are many things which might not cause death and injury, but might cause displacement and humanitarian need. Is there a case for the Mayor to do something different? And has that been looked at by the Mayor's office?
I think it's really important. The Mayor's role is to be that voice for London and to reassure people and talk to them, but the local resilience arrangements around housing and all those kinds of things do rightly fall to the boroughs, because in this building we can't provide that practical support.
No, it's the fundraising I'm talking about. So the London Emergencies Trust is basically the only vehicle we have for London-wide fundraising and distribution, and that is something potentially that is the Mayor's remit.
One of the other things that happened around Grenfell was that the regeneration team, which is led by Debbie Jackson, set up a fund to support businesses whose businesses had been impacted by the events of the fire, so where their customers couldn't get to them, for example. So we did that this time as well. So that, again, I think we would look to using those kinds of models again if it was appropriate as to how we can provide support. But that's the first one that springs to mind. But
from a British Red Cross perspective, we're very live to this, to some of the tensions you describe, and we've had a lot of conversations about it as an executive team. In fact, we published this report last week, Harnessing the Power of Kindness for Communities in Crisis. So I've done a lot of thinking about it. What, you know, the kind of point we've come to is that people should expect the British Red Cross to take that right to initiate in future, and that would include in the immediate aftermath of an emergency, us distributing cash ourselves. And we'd still want to work with distributing bodies on those essentially the distribution that requires casework, which is what LET have particular expertise in. However, you know, we feel we've got a duty to be there more quickly, and to be the organisation that people expect us to be, which, as you say, is a humanitarian aid organisation.
In the future, there'd be no blockage. You would give out cash, and you would want a blanket reassurance, presumably from people like DWP, that this wouldn't affect benefits and other things people might need to get from their local authorities.
That would be ideal. I mean, essentially, that's only one conversation that's gone on. We also were having a conversation with the Home Office about people who were worried about their immigration status, and them being given space to be able to have their humanitarian needs met first and foremost, for them to be seen as people first, and then worry about their immigration status in the fullness of time.
We had that conversation at our last review, actually. It took a long time to get that reassurance.
Yes.
I mean, it's just worth adding, among those important points that Zoe made just now, that last Friday, the Charity Commission got all of us and others together, because really the experience that's been gathered through 2017 has been in London and in Manchester, and there are obviously an incident could take place in any other town or city. So the question is as well how we collectively, and this inquiry is very clearly part of that, and all the better for it, take all that collective experience into government nationally to say when something happens, it's the age we live in, sadly, there is a proper response that recognises where the skills lie, where the ability to mobilise quickly lies, whether it's the BRC's team of volunteers, from Land's End northwards. There's got to be a better response, and there's also an issue that we've raised quite publicly with officials and with ministers when we've had the chance about the government's own support for what's gone on, not just in the capital city, because people who get caught up in these things come from wherever they come from when they're here. And at Grenfell, those were people who lived there, but with families next of kin in other places. So there are a whole range of really complicated issues that we need to work at to bring all this together in a better way for the future.
I can come in. Is that, that's almost like, even though you've got ongoing work to do, is that sort of your debrief of learning the lessons around this particular exercise? And around that table, were other groups, even smaller groups, involved in that conversation?
Yes, to both of those. Certainly not just Mark for RPT on the ground, but there were people there from Muslim Aid, there were people there from local Muslim communities contributing their experience to that discussion in a really, really important way.
When do you think that document will be available for the public?
I think it's going to take a little while yet, because that was a first meeting, and there's going to be a smaller group of people from that. I think there must have been 35 of us around that table on Friday morning last week, and there'll be a smaller group actually producing a report that pulls our direct collective experiences together. And there were people there from the local government association around the table as well, because of the national perspective.
For us, we've already submitted some evidence to one of the various public inquiries on the issues around the post-recovery response of the local government family. We'd be very keen to, even if there was a summary, an indication of some of the issues. I'm very keen about processes of what causing what. I get the issue, it's very clear about regional, national organisations working with local. That makes sense. I see it internationally as well. That arises from that. Now, quickly can you build that relationship up? I'm getting a picture around communication. I'm getting a picture that people want to do something, but sometimes their efforts aren't necessarily the right efforts. So the rush of giving you stuff that you don't really need is important that you deal with it, but actually it takes you away from the core bits you need to do in an immediate tragedy as you build up on other issues. So I'm getting a picture here developing, and we're obviously going to look at the transcript. We've got a few more questions to raise, but start to picking up some of those issues. Was that part of that conversation that you had around the table of all those things? Never mind the end recipient of any support, of how they felt, what it was like for them. It's always going to be difficult what it was like for the customer, the end person receiving something.
The meeting was very much about the charity response to this, and the role that charities, whatever they might be and whatever their skills and expertise may be, pull together to support first responders, support the immediate aftermath of all that. But you're absolutely right, there's a whole host of other things that sit with that.
Somehow we've got to get through that sort of personal data issue, because you mentioned
very
earlier
much so.
on about, in these circumstances, well, actually, how do we do that? Once we get that evidence, we can move on.
I mean, just on data, I mean, it may be a bit of a folk memory now, 12 years on, 13 years on, but in 2005, access to data wasn't difficult. We knew who to give money to through the then Gold Command, through the London teaching hospitals that took the injured and casualties, it took much longer this time, and I don't really understand why that should be.
So I think those that, for the Assembly members present, when we come to wrap this up, we shouldn't lose sight of some of these issues that are emerging, and I think we might be able to lend our voice to yours in terms of moving some of those issues forward. Sean, had you finished?
I am, yeah.
You had. Right, let's move on to section 5. We've got 2 more sections we'll be have tonight. In terms of section 5, is the really concentrating on the Mayor's role. Assembly Member Bacon.
Thank you, Chairman. Emma, this is all going to be aimed at you. The Mayor took a direct fundraising role, as was Grenfell, put the button on the london.gov website. How long did it take to set that up, and how long did it stay up?
I guess I wouldn't consider it as a direct fundraising role. What we did with that is we signposted to the Red Cross's fund. The reason why we did that is when we're in a situation, which is effectively an emergency, and we're receiving calls in from both the media and the public on where's the right place to donate. That felt the right way to provide that information to people. So that was effectively a hyperlink which drives to that place. So that's semantics, I'm aware of it, just to be clear on what that does. I'd have to check the dates on when it went up and how long it was there for, because I don't have that information to hand.
I was actually quite interested in how quickly it took to set that up.
It doesn't, from a technical perspective, it doesn't take us long. I can't remember when we decided that that would be the right thing to do and when it went live. Gareth, I don't know.
Do you have any data showing how many people clicked through that to the Red Cross site?
Again, I'm sorry, I don't know. I can check that.
Perhaps that can be circulated a bit later on. Are there any other examples of city mayors, probably not in this country because obviously there's only a few, but maybe overseas, acting in a similar way in response to similar circumstances?
I mean, I think it's happened in London on sort of other and different occasions. We've talked about the bombings, a relief fund from 2005. I think there is a place in the digital world for more direction from city mayors, because of the digital world has meant that there are so many different ways to donate and so many different options for that in terms of crowdfunding and how these things work. So personally, I think that the modern day age has made that role more important, and the digital world means it's easier for people who have less good intentions to establish sites and things. So providing good directions to what's the legitimate fund is really important.
Completely reasonable. In the event of another, hopefully there won't be, but in the event of another emergency such as this, is there anything that has been learned from the Grenfell process that the Mayor would do differently next time?
I think we would. I think we informally connected as a group here in a really good way right very early on. In fact, I checked my emails while we were talking earlier, and Gerald and I were in conversation at 8:38 on the morning after the fire broke out in that evening. So I think that those relationships for us are really good, and it's positive, and we should keep having those discussions. I think using the Mayor and his voice and his reach from a communications perspective is really important going forward.
Not been a wash up and a specific lessons learned.
One of the things that's come out of it that we are looking to do is to ensure that we can provide support to LET. So one of the very important things that all the money that's donated obviously goes to the victims and isn't used for administrative costs. So one of the things that we're working on currently is putting some money into place that LET can use to cover things like legal fees and the costs that they need to cover to actually run their operation. I'm speaking for Gerald now, but I think we've had corporate donations have come in to help do that, but the idea is that we put an amount of funding in, which means that Gerald and his colleagues can focus on the proper job and rely on that small pot of funding to cover those base costs, and not have to rush out to corporate funders to think about how they're going to cover legal fees, for example, in those early days. So that's one of the things that we're actively working on now.
So in terms of the signposting, I mean, everyone has their own memories of Grenfell Fire, but the following day everyone wakes up, they see the appalling pictures on the television, which obviously it drives people to want to do something about this, so they're looking to contribute. It makes perfect sense for the GLA website to be used to direct people. How quickly was it established here who the right people to signpost people to? How quickly was that done? Which I suppose is a supplementary question to someone asked you earlier on about setting up the button on the website.
I mean, we were working with the British Red Cross very early on in this process, and had been in the events prior to that with all of the other disasters. So we had a very strong working relationship with them. We also have worked previously with the Evening Standard and some of their funds, but it just seemed to us that the Red Cross are a natural and trusted partner for this piece. So that was the...
More or less instantaneously. Okay. Any more questions, John?
Okay, and then we're on the final, we're on the future. Navin Shah.
Yeah, thank you. Rob, you commented earlier on that some victims lost practically everything, and also touched upon kind of financial management related aspects. If I can ask you and Gerald, what legal advice has been offered to recipients of donations to help them manage their funds, both in the long and short term?
There are two main things we've been involved in. One, early on, we began conversations with other funders and with central government officials about the need for recipients of charitable donations to have access to free, high-quality advice to help them with financial management. There didn't seem to be a very strong need expressed by people we were dealing with, but we could see that if the distribution continued at the same pace, some individuals may have some really substantial amounts of money they weren't used to dealing with. I'm glad to say that at the end of last year that there was grant funding put into Kensington Chelsea Citizens Advice Bureau, who now offer that service to all charitable recipients. So if you are a bereaved family, you can go to the Family and Friends Assistance Centre and you can sit down with someone and get information about how you manage that. And Gerald talked about some of the more complex cases we're dealing with, and we have just a small number now where we are supporting families to set up legal trusts for a number of reasons, including minority. And we work closely with a law firm that's offering their specialist services pro bono. So this is a very expensive area of legal activity for people normally, and we've got a very high quality firm that will come down and work with families to explain what this is, to find a solution that works for them, and a solution that gives the trustees confidence that we can make a payment into that trust and that it will benefit in the medium and long term the child and the child's family. So these are the two main areas we're involved in.
That's totally free service.
That's totally free. Where there is an unknown, it's where there's a complex family situation where a professional trustee may be required. We haven't quite got to that point yet, but it's a possibility. In that case, we may need to ask someone to put in a considerable amount of time over a number of years pro bono, or we may need to look at ways of paying for that.
You can assure this committee that you are satisfied that there is adequate legal provision in terms of advice available to those victims who are recipients of various levels of donations.
Well, I think certainly in respect of the donations that LET has been giving out, which others have commented on, to two particular groups, yes, we think there is support. It remains to be seen whether people use it, and to be frank, what their feedback is on that. But it's certainly there on the table. I'm less clear about what's available for the households who've received money from other means, but they can access the Citizens Advice support, and actually a lot of families we are dealing with now have law firms offering pro bono support to them generally. So my experience is they tend to sweep up a number of legal issues and have a point person with the family, and then their colleagues support them on issues like housing and finances and immigration and so on.
Is there adequate mechanism to check that this process is working, and if it isn't, remedial measures to put in place?
I think probably the first point will be that Citizens Advice will need to account for their activity with the government departments that fund them, and I think it's DCMS. So they will need to account for that and provide some data on that. And certainly once we know we're at the end of distribution to our particular subset, we can go back to them and make contact with them and ask them about their experiences. We tend to pick up
monitoring is critical. You know, can have best system in place, but if it doesn't quite work on the ground, that needs to be picked up so that it's fit for purpose in the end.
I mean, we have a relatively small number of cases, 71 bereaved cases, so we work very closely with those in day-to-day contact with the families to make sure that if there are issues coming up like that, we can point them in the right direction.
Yeah. I have a question for Zoe. Is there a way to better educate the public about how to give in disaster situations, both in terms of gifts as well as cash donations?
Indeed, of the 8 points our reports made, 2 of them are about harnessing kindness following a major incident, which says that people should know how best to give their financial support in emergency and be supported to do so. They should be assured that their donations will go to people affected quickly, simply and equitably. And also that people should be supported to give in ways that will help the most vulnerable. So that's about it's about coordination between national, local, regional bodies, between the authorities and charities, and it's just about giving people clarity. And I think we've all worked really hard together to try and give that to people in crisis and to the public, and it has, you know, it's been a rich source of learning, and I think we have to do better if and when a terrible tragedy like this ever happens again.
Can I just make one further point, because it's a softer point, but it's often overlooked, which is, although families may have access to sound financial advice, in actual fact, like every family at Grenfell and like any other family, there are tensions and conflicts between people, and when you put money in the mix, it sometimes exacerbates those issues. And my experience is that families have less options of a place to go to get help resolving that at present. They're very reliant on the key worker to do some of that. They're very complex issues. Most have very close relationships with the police family liaison officers, but that is well outside of their remit and scope. But this is a very real issue for people who have been through trauma, are bereft, have got through the access to money part, and then there are challenging, in some cases, family dynamics, and I think we'd do well to think about that support being available to people. Now that's difficult for families to go and ask for that, but having it on offer would be extremely helpful from our point of view.
Thank you for that. I have a broad question for the panel, and that is, how can civil actions like volunteering, gifts in kind, be better coordinated around emergencies, particularly the infrastructure that it requires?
That's quite difficult to come up with a solution that works in that way. I think what you highlight in the question is very real, very pertinent. What our collective experience has been, all of us as whether fundraisers or distributors or service providers, is that when something happens, people are incredibly generous. You can look at pretty well any incident, large or small, that's happened anywhere in the country. People galvanise, they get stuck in, they want to help. You can take a completely different example to everything we've talked about this morning. Look at the floods in Cumbria in recent memory, where the local community foundation was the focus of a lot of that, harnessing not only their donors and going out after other money, but also acting as the focal point for local people and local organisations to help in those circumstances. It's hugely impressive. Some of that is also galvanised by British Red Cross volunteers on the ground and BRC itself. So there is the makings of that infrastructure. I think we need to be careful not to put too much in the way of individuals' generosity and wanting to help, but there also needs to be some mechanism to channel that in the right way, because certainly as far as fundraising is concerned, when people want to open up a Just Giving page, let's say, who would want to stand in the way of doing that? Our responsibility, and again I'm thinking of my day job rather than my LET trustee role here, is to make sure that we, at the Fundraising Regulator and the Charity Commission, provide simple, straightforward advice to say, if you want to open up a Just Giving page or use one of the other platforms, this is what you do, this is how it works, and these are the things to bear in mind when you do it. For example, specify as well as you can who the beneficiary of the money you want to raise is to be. Because if you don't, it will cause delay in the money getting to where you want it to go. Very simple messages like that, though they're quite complicated underneath. So there's a bit of work to do there, and I think that also reflects everyone's collective learning.
I think there is something about coordinating volunteering. But when I think in the immediate aftermath of Grenfell, it was people who stood up and did whatever needed to be done. And in some ways, we expected and we paid for a coordinated response from local government, from regional government, from national government, and it was absent. And actually, that space was occupied by volunteers. And we don't actually need to ask people's permission for them to help. We need to allow them to have their own agency and occupy that space when they need to, and in some ways support them. A lot of that's still going on the ground in Grenfell. We've got lots of people who are still volunteering, who were never volunteering before, but still see there's a job to be done. The issue of coordinating volunteers in terms of a civil emergency and how they can be an auxiliary to government, I think that's a really important question. But you actually shouldn't really be giving permission for people to volunteer. It's their absolute right to help one another.
And I think
I do need to do something procedurally. Under section 2.9 of our standing orders, we're going to extend our meeting to conclude our business. But can I just take that point up in the sense, I don't think it is permission. I've very much taken with your points about the strategy. It's about how do you help people channel their efforts into the right way. And that's the really difficult bit, isn't it? Because they think they're actually doing the right way. You ending up with a street full of nappies is quite an interesting example of that. Well-meaning, well-intended to help and support, but actually that wasn't the right bit.
It's a question of guiding them.
And so what could you know, so is there a case, and I think it's a case for everyone, I don't think it's, about that, of just trying to say, look, this is where it's at, immediately a disaster happens, this is what we think our immediate response is, and we're going to try and carry on with that. Is that possible? Is that unrealistic?
I think it is, except there was a vacuum. So
yes,
actually, that's what occupied the vacuum. It's that people it's people standing up and doing what they think they can and what they're able. But because there was no messaging, there is a fire, we want you to, stay away from the area, we're after people with these skills and this kind of thing, and this needs to happen, and so there was nothing. So people occupied that vacuum themselves.
We've had that conversation on that post-recovery issue, and we would fully concur with that on a number of levels. Can I just bring Andrew Boff in and I'll bring you back?
Very quickly, I'm going to try and ask the same question. The same question in a different way. Fools seldom differ, For the future, is more clarity required as to who is coordinating? Or was the clarity there and they just didn't coordinate? Do you understand the subtlety of the question?
I'm no expert in this. I can only talk about my
experience. From your experience,
that's
exactly what we want to hear.
From our experience, nothing happened. So if someone was supposed to have done it, they didn't.
But you weren't aware of who was supposed to be doing
We just knew, we were told to call the Beck, right? And so we had to work out what the Beck was, and it's the Borough Emergency Command Centre, and I'm still to this day waiting for somebody to ring me back. So that was the information we were given until people started to show up. People like the Red Cross, people like Susan and her team saying, how can we help? Our friends and neighbours saying, we've heard from Clement James, someone's there from Hammersmith and Fulham, and it just was that build-up. There was no coordinated, or it certainly didn't feel like for a couple of days.
So the borough spent a long time, the GLA spends a long time getting together a plan for this kind of eventuality, but you didn't know who was in charge. That's what I'm trying to get. And is that a similar view? I don't want to from the others.
I look at Team London volunteering. You know, they're great at this stuff, and not only do they provide brilliant volunteers, but they also provide people to coordinate those volunteers. And I think we've all been, it's come up here numerous times. The key thing is about how do you can, if you go out on social media and there's been an issue and say you need volunteers, hundreds of people will turn up, but then they don't know what to do, and you don't know what to do with them. So there is something about that coordination point. And for me, there's something around how do we equip as many organisations as possible with the knowledge that there are resources out there that can help them, and how do we tell them that when we're not in the middle of an emergency situation? How do we ensure that all the boroughs know that Team London volunteers are trained in resilience and can be called on, for example? How do they know? How do they know that Zoe?
It's going to be around for a while, because what you don't want is re-traumatising people by getting them to tell their story to 55 different people.
Indeed,
because
yes, that's
volunteers are there short term.
Isn't that the question about where I think we lie ourselves, the vacuum of that if things were working on post-recovery well, and it takes many forms, and almost like from, if you say day 1 will be different from day 15, and everyone was doing their bit, things would happen much more quickly, and you would be able to do what you need to do. But those very points from a survivor's perspective of, actually I'm talking to about 4 different people, and quite frankly my head is spinning because what I've just suffered with, and never mind all other people offering me help there. And I think there was a failure of that post-recovery response at a number of levels, and we've just got to try and get a grips with that, because unfortunately, as Gerald said, there will be other situations. And so that's why we're quite interested in learning from those experiences, and we're also interested in learning about what you think works. And I'm quite interested in of putting them into processes that people are clear. Do you know what I mean? And in a sense, what happened informally, I think, when you were asked to turn up, and expertise and many others trying to grapple with the plans, it just didn't happen. But people were trying to put it in because they realised, what if it was important enough to try and do something on that Saturday, never mind in terms of the operational response, then it ought to go in very clearly the next time. We shouldn't be having this conversation again around the table about some of the circumstances we find ourselves in.
So many of us here had a meeting a couple of months ago with Tracy Crouch, the Mental Physical Society, and Mark made a suggestion at that, which I thought was really good, was that there should be a clear lead for the voluntary sector in gold. So that would be one way that it could, that being a formal role. And again, many of us were in a meeting with Grenfell United quite soon after the incident. What the people in the room asked for was for a single fund, and actually the Charity Commission went away and did. It was after that meeting that they started publishing the updates. That's what people in crisis were saying. They wanted a single fund. So whilst I completely agree, we want diversity we want diversity in the sector, we want diversity of generosity, we want diversity of kindness, and people who are in crisis are asking for a coordination of that as well. So a single fund and a single lead, or a largely predominant fund and a single lead in gold for voluntary sector right from the get-go, so with RBCK, and then carrying on into when John Barradell got involved would be some of our recommendations.
Can I bring Emma and then I'll bring Robert in?
Just very briefly, I think for me this just comes back to this leadership point. You know, who is in charge, and who is saying what should be, who is taking control. It's very difficult for lots of organisations to do everything by committee in a really quick period of time. And I think my reflection on it now is that everybody did a fantastic job at moving as quickly as was possible in a slight leadership vacuum.
I think in some ways in that leadership vacuum, but I think we can do better. I think you're telling me we can do better. I think we've come into the conclusion, the evidence we've heard even before you even walked into the room, that I think we can do better. I think some of that is clarifying who that leadership is, and I think in different roles. But I think there's also about placing the table, a place in the structures, and I think from what you're telling us today, there is this issue about the community-led sector / voluntary sector bit, and then there is the survivors stroke next of kin bit and other dependents, and we try and need to bring forward both because they need to go forward post-recovery at different, they might be at different timescales, but we've got to try and speed up that process for getting some money out to people in real need, to supporting those people in terms of some of the things they're faced with. And I've very much taken that back about one of your best practices, maybe keeping Corbett money back for some of those extra supports that we didn't quite envisage that we might, in terms of a future disaster, we need. So that will, you know, it's a question about how you divvy up the pot, isn't it, and some of those issues. So I'm minded to take on that. I've got a couple of, I've said I'd bring some people in as well. So Robert and David, then I've got a couple of Assembly members. Coming back, Robert.
I've heard a lot about the quality of relationships, really important here, especially in a low trust environment. And Mark's described how Rugby Portobello had that in spades. We had it with the families we dealt with, very quietly in the background with the police. We were frustrated by the rotation of key personnel who were there to give advice and information and responsible for communications. That isn't a comment on them as individuals. They, if you were seconded in or volunteered to come in and get stuck in. But you would just build up a relationship. You would think that this person understands what financial support is available, and they'd be off again. And there was one week, I think it was week 2 or 3, I went to Westway, and I walked around and I went to the financial assistance desk and I asked them what they did, and they were delighted. They said, London Emergencies Trust, we've sort of heard about you. What do you do? And essentially they were there just to point people towards a helpline and a discretionary fund. So they didn't have any sense of it wasn't that complicated a funding picture at that time. There were several main funders. There were clear routes in. So at that level, the people had been in the job 2 days. There'd been some sort of handover, but they didn't know. And I think people on the ground experienced that repeatedly. It built up the irritation about the whole thing. It compounded the view that the thing was a shambles. And so I think there's a principle in there which is, as much as you can, invest in stability. Don't rotate people out because it's really important. That's why the charities there do so well, because they're there and they're permanent, they know people.
Point well made. David.
So I gave notice to which I have to leave for a board meeting shortly, but just a couple of points to make. I think in terms of the learning from this committee and the coordination with about 4 or 5 other pieces of work going on, it'd be really great if this committee could proactively link in with those pieces, and it would be helpful, I think, within certain government departments to help them join up. In terms of actually what exists now, I think in terms of any response to this, is being very clear about the kind of the different tapestry that exists across the UK actually in terms of the community voluntary sector, some of the infrastructure, which is of differing levels of expertise and strength across the country. But there's a lot already through that, and also through the independent funder networks actually. So it's thinking about what's there and getting an accurate picture, and then sometimes resourcing that up rather than a parallel universe that could come up out of this. But forgive me having to leave slightly early.
Please do, and thank you very much for your contribution. Now, I've got Navin Shah's come back. Sean, you sure? Navin, do you want to just finish off? I think this is actually our last set of questions. Is it?
I've got a different question.
Yeah.
Do you want Sean
No,
to?
no.
Okay, fine. I mean, obviously, it's gratifying that, you had very generous donations, lots of funds raised and distributed. But given some of the difficulties that we have discussed, etc., is there any kind of reviews? Are there any reviews taking place on the sort of charitable giving aspects, or is there, do you reckon, any need for overhauling of a radical overhaul of what's happened?
Oh, there are reviews. There are more reviews going on than anybody might know. I mean, there's this one. There's the gathering that we were all at on Friday at the Charity Commission. Okay, that was looking towards what a national response might be in future, but it's also about reviewing what we've all done. I think individually we've all looked at our own, and we are looking at our own performance and coming to a view about what we could do better. I know inside LET we want to get an independent look at what we did, how we did it, and when we did it across all 5 incidents we've been working on, as well as the support we were able to give to Manchester colleagues. So yes, that's going on. I'm pretty certain that pretty well every government department involved in Whitehall is looking at what happened, and we expect any moment to be asked to contribute in a very similar way to this, which we're happy to do, because it's about the learning. But I do worry that with all the different inquiries, I hope they come out with similar conclusions. Otherwise, it's going to get even more complicated than it is now.
I mean, is it sort of showing where direction in terms of radical overhaul, or you reckon overall it's worked?
I wouldn't necessarily say it was a radical overhaul, but we certainly need to understand what we all did, how it happened, and evolve what we do, so that where there are areas of expertise that exist in either in individual charities or more widely in the public sector, it's clear what they are and how they are to be drawn on if there's a repeat. So that, if I just take LET, what we know about is support to next of kin and injured, and I think our role will be to spread that knowledge and information. We tried to do it in 2005, but with the march of time it got lost. We mustn't make that mistake again. It needs to evolve and it needs to get better, because I think, without wanting to appear self-satisfied or smug in any way about this, we did do the best job we could in the circumstances we found. I think it was probably a good job in the end. It may not have felt like that as it was being done, but we need to build on that, learn where we didn't get it as good as we could have done, but also make clear that this worked and other people can do this in future.
There's one other review going on which is being funded by the Muslim Aid Foundation, which is working entirely from a local perspective about what happened with the local organisations, how they responded, and could they be more coordinated to speak to a national response. So that's going on now.
Great. One final very pertinent question, and that is to you, Gerald, as a fundraising regulator. At least there was one incident which was reported, I think on 1st of October, about a fraudulent website, which obviously is something always worries, who is actually collecting allegedly donations. Was that properly dealt with? And have you had any further incidents like that? And is there any mechanism whereby that can be curbed entirely or be dealt with more effectively for this as well as any other fundraising activities that we may?
Thankfully, as far as we're all aware, there's been very little fraud. Rugby Portobello spotted a couple of cases very early on and dealt with them in absolutely the right way. It's a criminal matter. It goes straight to the police and or action fraud where that's spotted. The fundraising platforms where the greatest vulnerability lies here have got a lot of very sophisticated algorithms that they use, so that when somebody opens up a page for the first time, there are all sorts of background checks. We know that at Westminster, very quickly, it was, I can't remember whether it was GoFundMe or Just Giving, one of those two, spotted that somebody opening a page had just served time in prison for fraud, and that page was quarantined straight away. So we're on this. If the public has any worries about it, then the place to go is either us, where it's fundraising, and or the Charity Commission. We talk to each other all the time, and we take action as best we can in the circumstances. But I think my message is that if anybody thinks there's a fraud going on, straight to the police. It's the quickest way to get it dealt with, as well as telling the organisations concerned who might be affected.
Thank you, that's reassuring.
Well, can I, on behalf of the committee, thank you in the way that you answered our questions and bore with us, even if we slightly went off on some of the wider remarks. Our intention has always been not to try and duplicate other areas of work. And we chose this area of work because we thought that we needed to shine a light on it, and not because, partly because I think the nature of the tragedy that you were dealing with and still dealing with, that we thought we might lend our voice to some of those issues, and I think that's been very useful for us. We've asked for some information from various people. We will follow that up. Once we read the transcripts, we might come back with some further questions, and if you can respond. If there's anything that you, after walking away from this meeting, think, oh, I wish I'd said that, I want to say this, then please come back to us, because we will be putting pen to paper around some of these issues. And then finally, because I don't think we do this enough or in an appropriate form, and I hope people have already said this to you and to your colleagues who are not around this table, thank you for the work that you've done. It's very difficult, it was very complex. Yes, there were problems. We will, hopefully everyone will seek to reduce those problems for the future as and when they happen. But I want to thank you for the work that you've done, and we're constantly in awe of some of the work that goes on behind the scenes that don't, you know, the media doesn't quite get it unless there's a sensationalism part of it or something like a bad news story. And in some ways you've helped victims and their families a little bit further in this terrible tragedy, and thank you for that and your ongoing work. So thank you. We're going to continue on. We've got a few more bits of business to do, so please leave, and we will be in contact. If we can go back to the main agenda then, so item 6 is a fairly straightforward issue that I just need to read out the formal words for the committee. I asked that the committee on item 6, this is the relating to the summons of the Right Honourable Boris Johnson MP, who many of you will be aware was the former Mayor of London. So I'm asking the committee to A, agree that the GLA Oversight Committee meeting scheduled to take place at 2 p.m. on the 22nd of February 2018 be rescheduled to 2 p.m. on the 1st of March 2018. B, rescind the summons notice authorised on the 14th of December 2017 and issue to the Right Honourable Boris Johnson MP requiring his attendance as former Mayor of London at the meeting of the GLA Oversight Committee at 2 p.m. on the 22nd of February 2018 under the provisions of Section 61(1), 61(5)(c) and Section 62 of the Greater London Authority Act in 1999 as amended, and C, under the provisions of Section 61(1), 61(5)(c) and Section 62 of the Greater London Authority Act as amended, require the attendance of the Right Honourable Boris Johnson MP as the former Mayor of London at the meeting of the GLA Oversight meeting on the 1st of March 2018 at 2 p.m, for which the notice will be given in accordance with Section 62 of the Greater London Authority Act as amended, the Greater London Authority Act 1999 as amended in due course to answer questions in relation to the Garden Bridge project. Agreed. Thank you. Moving on to item 7, the proposed changes to the GLA Establishment Health Unit. We have Amanda Coyle, Assistant Director of Health, Education and Youth, will report if you wish to. Are there any, or would you prefer to go straight to questions? Or you prefer to take note the report? Thank you very much. We're noting the report. Moving on to item 8, work programme for the GLA Oversight Committee. We're recommended to note the work programme for the remainder of 2017/18. Assembly year has set out the report, identifying the additional issues it wishes to consider in future meetings. Shall we do that outside this meeting? Agreed. Item 9 is the date of the next meeting. There's obviously a change because of the decision we've previously taken. The next meeting will be of this committee on the 1st of March 2018 in the chamber at 2 p.m. to look at the question around the Garden Bridge project with the former Mayor. Moving on, item 10, I've not been notified of any other urgent business. I now declare this meeting closed. Thank you very much.
GLA Chamber Sound.